Hello everyone, I am the Macabre. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Sit back and relax. In the heart of a mountainous region in the state of Hidalgo stands the old sanatorium of the Shadowy Valley, a place that has been abandoned for decades and whose mere mention causes shivers among the inhabitants of the nearby towns. The building, with its Gothic architecture and broken windows, is a vestige of another time, when it functioned as a psychiatric hospital. It is said that unspeakable atrocities occurred here, and legends speak of lost souls wandering through the country. The corridors trapped in an eternity of suffering for three university friends, Sofia, Diego, and Mariana. The sanatorium was the perfect stop in their search for strong emotions armed with inmates, a camera and a voice recorder. They decided to visit the place and find out if the stories were true. They arrived at nightfall. The road meandered between the twisted and dark trees, as if trying to block their way by parking in front of the rusty gate. The silence was almost sepulchral, not even Los Grillos dared to sing. The moon, hidden behind thick clouds, barely illuminated the silhouettes of the crumbling towers of the sanatorium. "Surely we want to enter?" Mariana asked, hugging herself as she looked at the decaying structure. "Of course she did," Sofia replied with an attempt at courage. "No one is going to believe us if we don't document it." Diego, trying to hide his nervousness, he added with a trembling smile, "Think of the story we will have to tell later." They forced a side window and, with difficulty, entered the building. The interior smelled of dust, humidity, and something else, something stale and old like death. The walls were covered with graffiti and the doors hung from their hinges, some with deep scratch marks. Sofia took the lead, focusing on the corridor with her flashlight. "This looks like a scene from a horror movie," she muttered with her voice. Mariana, clinging to Diego's arm, nodded with pursed lips. The echo of their footsteps resounded as if someone was following them. The shadows danced in the corners, projected by the shaky light of the lanterns. When they reached the main hall, an old wheelchair remained in the center of the room. The rusty metal creaked when Sofia came to photograph him. "They hear that?" Mariana whispered. Looking back, Diego shook his head, but his expression reflected uneasiness. He turned on the recorder and in a firm voice asked into the void if anyone is here. "Can tell us a name?" A long silence continued. Then the recorder emitted a distorted click, a weak voice, but Clara resounded outside. Mariana let out a gasp. Sofia turned pale as she reviewed the recording. "It must be static or in turf," she said, although her eyes betrayed their disbelief. Determined to finish what they had started, they continued to explore. They went up to the second floor, where the patients' rooms remained almost intact. Rusty beds, threadbare sheets, and names engraved on the walls with a child's handwriting. At the end of the corridor, Diego opened a door that creaked as it ajar. It was the old infirmary. "We could be here," Mariana said. Trembling on one of the stretchers lay a black leather notebook. Sofia took it. Carefully, looking through its yellowed pages, the writings described inhumane treatments, electros, extreme isolation, and something else. A strange symbol was repeated between the lines, as if someone had drawn it obsessively. "This is not normal," Diego murmured, looking away. A sharp noise startled him. When they turned around, they saw how a shadow crossed the corridor. An icy shiver ran through them. "Let's run, please," Mariana begged, almost on the verge of tears. But Sofia, determined, insisted on going down to the basement. According to legends, the most intense demonstrations occurred there. The descent was narrow and dark. The air was heavy and stinking, as if they were breathing a gas ancient and poisonous. The walls were covered with symbols carved in the stone, similar to those in the notebook. Then they heard it, a deep growl like that of a trapped beast. The light of the lanterns began to flicker. Mariana screamed when she saw red eyes shining at the end of the corridor. A tall and hunched figure of the shadows slowly advancing towards them. "Run!" Diego shouted, pulling Mariana while Sofia tried to document it with her camera. The basement became chaos. Doors that closed by themselves, voices that whispered their names, and a cold that froze the bones. When they reached the stairs, they found the door locked behind them. The figure was approaching, their steps rumbling loudly. Suddenly, the door hit with a sharp bang, as if a force invisible would have opened it. They shot outside without looking back. They got into the car and Diego stepped on the accelerator, leaving behind the sanatorium of the dark valley already safe. Sofia reviewed the photographs on the camera. In each of them, in addition to the figure of the red eyes, other silhouettes were seen, shadowy bodies and faces without defined features, watching them from the corners. None of the three of them spoke of the sanatorium ever again. But at night, when they closed their eyes, the voices still whispered and the red eyes continued to watch from the shadows. This story reminded me of the stories I used to hear from my grandmother about abandoned hospitals, and so the lost in the mountains, places where atrocities were committed disguised as treatments. I find it fascinating and terrifying to think how these buildings, even when they have been abandoned, seem to retain the energies of what happened between their families. Walls may not be ghosts in the traditional sense, but echoes of human suffering trapped in an eternal loop, and there is something unsettling about the idea of exploring such a place. The sepulchral silence, the graffiti, and the forgotten objects that tell a story without words. I have always thought that these places have a way of observing you as if they were living entities waiting for someone to wake them up. The notebook with symbols and the red eyes make me think of ancient rituals, dark cults that find their space in the oblivion of these ruins. Curiously enough, many psychiatric hospitals in the past used symbols or coded records to mark certain patients or ritualized treatments. It is possible that this story is inspired by that mixture of real horror and urban legends. In the end, what strikes me the most is how the protagonists did not manage to leave behind what they found, as if something from the sanatorium had followed them. Maybe there are places that never want to be forgotten and always find a way to return with you. Greetings to the members of the channel, Yamale Vasquez and Jose Jesus Puga. If you want to support the channel even more, you can become a member, and your name will be mentioned. When you become a member, you will have early access to videos and many more advantages. Thank you for your support. It was a cold night in November when Alex and his friends Samuel and Jessica arrived outside the ruins of the old San Rafael Sanatorium on the outskirts of Guanajuato. The abandoned structure stood before them like a sleeping beast. Its silhouette shattered and its empty windows seemed to stare at them with silent contempt. Urban legends enveloped the place, stories of tormented patients and cruel doctors whose spirits still haunted its halls. Their schoolmates had challenged them to come in. One night there was a test of courage that neither the brave nor the foolish could refuse. "You're sure of this?" Jessica murmured, clutching her flashlight tightly. Her voice betrayed her nervousness, and the atmosphere seemed to respond to her with a heavy silence. "It's going to be fine," Samuel said, trying to laugh although the sound was forced. "We went in, we looked for a while, and we leave easily." Alex didn't say anything. It was he who insisted on coming, moved by the curiosity and to show that he was not afraid of anything. However, as they approached the entrance, a shiver ran down his spine. They forced their way through a broken window and slipped inside. The darkness was suffocating, and the air had a dense smell of humidity and rot. Their lanterns revealed walls covered with old and peeling graffiti, but nothing could hide the oppressive feeling that the sanatorium breathed. "This place of fear," muttered Jessica. "That's the point," Alex replied, although his voice lacked conviction. "Let's go to the main hall." The wide hall greeted them like a forgotten cathedral. The ceiling was covered in peeling paint and cobwebs, and rusty stretchers and broken wheelchairs were scattered on the floor. Their footsteps reverberated as if the walls were amplifying every movement. They heard that. Samuel stopped in dry, his flashlight shining on a dark "Listen," what Jessica answered, clinging to Alex's arm. "Steps, as if someone wasn't still safe." "They are rats," Alex said. Although his own flashlight was shaking slightly, they kept going further and deeper into the labyrinth of hallways, which seemed to twist and change at every turn. Each door they passed groaned slightly, as if the building itself was trying to warn them. They found some stairs that led to the basement. "Not even crazy went down there," Jessica exclaimed, her firm but trembling voice. For what didn't Alex challenge, although he himself didn't want to go down, because in all horror stories the basement is where everything goes wrong. Samuel saw nervously. "He's right. Let's continue." Here in their exploration, they stumbled upon an old game room. There was a pool table covered in dust and broken glass. The walls had deep scratch marks, as if someone had tried to escape with their bare hands. "Okay, this is no longer funny," Samuel said. "Let's take some pictures and go." Just as Jessica was preparing her phone for a selfie, the screen flickered and the device suddenly shut down. "What did Demon have a full battery?" he murmured at that moment. An icy wind crossed the room, turning off the flashlights one by one. "What's going on?" Jessica shouted with obvious panic. "Calm," Alex tried to say, but even he couldn't keep his composure. He took out some spare batteries, but before he could place them, a guttural moan filled the air, coming from everywhere and none at once. "That wasn't a rat," Samuel murmured, his face pale under the filtering moonlight. The moan became a chorus of heartbreaking screams. Jessica grabbed Alex by the arm so hard that she left him. "We have to get out of here." "We are all right," Alex replied, his bravery falling apart. "Let's go back to the window." But when he turned around in his steps, something was wrong. The corridors had changed. Doors that were open were now closed with rusty padlocks. They walked in circles, trapped in a spiral with no way out. "It can't be Joe, Samuel. It's as if the place was fooling us." Suddenly they entered what looked like an old operating room. Rust-covered tools were strewn across a stained table. Chains hung from the ceiling, moving slightly for no apparent reason. In the center of the room was an antique wheelchair with worn leather straps. "We have to go," Jessica said, stepping back. Then the chair squeaked and slowly turned toward them. A figure began to materialize on the seat. A woman in a torn hospital gown, and her face, hidden by a tuft of matted hair, raised its head and its empty eyes shone with an indescribable hatred. "Get out!" his voice resounding like thunder in the living room. Without thinking about it, the three of them ran while the woman's macabre laughter resounded in their ears. The sanatorium seemed to vibrate with life of its own. Doors that closed, walls that creaked, stumbling and panting. Finally reached the main hall. "The window!" Alex shouted, but before shadows arrived materialized in front of them. They were dark, blurry figures that moved as if they were trapped between this world and another. "Around here," Alex pointed out. They saw an emergency door in the background, ran towards it and pushed with all their might until finally they shot out into the cold of the night without stopping until they reached their car. No one dared to look back as they sped away from the sanatorium. Raphael, hours later in Alex's room, they were trying to assimilate what had happened. Jessica checked her phone that had been turned back on inexplicably. A photo was in the gallery taken without them knowing. It showed the three of them in the operating room with the ghostly woman standing right behind them, her hollow eyes looking straight at the camera. "We never go back there," Samuel said firmly. "In agreement," Alex replied, although inside I knew that night would haunt them forever. This story reminded me of the urban legends of my childhood, when rumors about abandoned buildings and ghostly apparitions ran between friends as a test of bravery. In my city there was also an old hospital closed decades ago, and although I never dared to enter, I remember companions who swore to hear whispers or feel stares as they passed by. I have always been intrigued by how these places with its load of stories and suffering seem to absorb the energy of those who once inhabited them. What strikes me most about the sanatorium in this story is how the place itself becomes a more alive, deceptive and malevolent character. That idea that walls can change and trap you, or that shadows can materialize, reflects something that we humans deeply fear. Losing control of reality will be that the memories of the tragedies are trapped in the corners of these places. There are theories that suggest that extreme suffering can imprint residual energy on objects or spaces, which could explain paranormal phenomena. On the other hand, the final photo adds a disturbing layer, the inexplicable evidence that connects the physical world with the supernatural. That type of images has always given me chills, because one never expects the unknown to appear. So how many times have we captured something in a photo without realizing it? Maybe the line between this world and the other is thinner than we imagine. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to leave your like. That helps us a lot to continue bringing you more stories like this. And remember, you can join the Members Club to have early access and exclusive content. Subscribe now and join me on more trips. Nestled deep in the misty mountains of the state of Hidalgo, the small town of San Sebastian kept a dark secret on the outskirts. Among twisted trees and forgotten roads lay the ruins of the San Antonio Hospital, a former psychiatric sanatorium abandoned and shrouded in terrifying legends for decades. Locals had whispered tales of ghostly apparitions, heart-rending screams, and unexplained lights that lit up in the middle of the night. Only the bravest or most reckless dared to approach its crumbling walls. Martin, a young journalist obsessed with paranormal stories, decided to investigate the hospital for a special report. His career depended on discovering stories that would freeze the blood, and the San Antonio Sanatorium seemed the perfect setting. Beyond the horror stories, there were documents about patient abuse, unexplained disappearances, and a fire that had consumed part of the building in 1976, which led to its definitive closure at sunset. Martin arrived at the hospital with a flashlight, a tape recorder, and his camera in hand, the facade of the place covered with graffiti and vines. I watched him like a sleeping giant. The broken windows looked like open and hungry mouths, and the air was loaded with humidity and a penetrating smell of rotten earth. When crossing the front door, the atmosphere changed to an unnatural cold enveloped him. and the silence seemed to pulsate like a dying heart. The L in his flashlight barely illuminated the peeling wallpaper and the rusty furniture that cast haunting shadows. Martin began his tour calmly, documenting every corner. The patient's cells were small and oppressive, with metal beds corroded by time. In one corner he found a pile of broken and dusty children's toys. The ward of pediatrician, he thought, and a shiver ran down his spine as he went. His restlessness grew. He heard barely audible whispers, like voices blown by the wind. He first thought it was his imagination, but then, at the edge of his vision, he saw a shadow moving quickly down the hallway. "Hello." His echo was the only thing he answered. He came to what was once the Kid Faynes. This place was known for stories from inhumane procedures and cruel experiments in the center. A rusty surgical stretcher stood like a macabre altar. Ancient and sharp tools were scattered around him. Just then Martin noticed something on the wall. Bloody handprints were fresh, with a racing heart. He raised the camera and took a photo. The flash lit up the room. For an instant, and at that moment he saw someone. A figure was on the edge of the room, barely visible in the shadows. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. "Calm, calm," he whispered to himself, although his voice trembled. He continued to advance to the east wing, the most affected by the fire. The air smelled of old smoke, as if the flames still burned in the past. There, in the midst of charred rubble, he found a notebook with a scorched leather cover. It was the diary of a nurse, named Leonore, who he had worked in the last days of the hospital. The entrances were getting more and more desperate, patients speaking strange languages, companions disappearing without explanation, and a shadow that seemed to move through the corridors. The last page was a warning: "The shadows are alive. Call me by my name. If anyone finds this, go away. Don't let them catch you. The hospital is cursed." A rumble on the top floor startled him, swallowed hard, and went up the wooden stairs, creaking with every step at the end of the hallway. He entered a room where an old wheelchair was slowly spinning as if someone had just used it. Suddenly the door slammed shut. Martin's flashlight began to flicker and an icy temperature enveloped him. A low, guttural growl emerged from the darkness as he turned. Gave a woman in a nurse's uniform torn his eyes. They were empty and his mouth open in a silent scream. Martin stumbled backwards and fell to the ground as the figure advanced towards him. He managed to stand up and ran as fast as he could. The echo of footsteps behind him. He was chasing him, but he did not dare to look back. When he reached the main hall, the silence returned, oppressive and suffocated. The entire hospital seemed to be alive. The doors closed by themselves. The shadows where the flashlight died, leaving him in complete darkness. With trembling hands, he used the screen of his cell phone to light the way. When he saw the front door, he felt an ephemeral relief. However, a figure appeared in front of him, a man in a straitjacket, his head tilted at an impossible angle. "You should not have come here," the man whispered, his voice reverberating like thunder in the Martin's mind. The doors slammed shut, and the man disappeared with a survival instinct on the edge. Martin ran to a nearby window, hit the saw with all his strength until he broke it and fell on the wet grass outside. Injured and trembling, he got up and ran to his car without looking back. As he started and sped away, he saw in the rearview mirror how the hospital was still standing, with some windows shining with a spectral light. That night, as he was reviewing the recordings, he heard something strange. A voice that didn't. "I was there when he recorded You Can't Escape." Martin erased all the material and abandoned the story. But the nightmares never stopped. Some nights when I woke up startled, I swore I saw a dark shadow standing at the foot of his bed. This story reminded me of the stories I used to hear as a child about abandoned hospitals and cursed places that seemed to come alive at nightfall. I've always been fascinated by how spaces can absorb the energy of what happened there, as if the walls kept echoes of the suffering, fear and despair of those who passed through them. Places like the San Antonio hospital involved in tragedy seem to transform into something more, as if time could not erase what happened there. It strikes me how Martin, despite his courage or ambition, faces what clearly many would avoid. Sometimes I think that people that bus or paranormal end up being called by these presences, as if they themselves wanted to be discovered, and if the shadows of the hospital were not just hallucinations, maybe they are fragments of the souls that are still trapped in that place, desperately looking to be heard, or worse, to take revenge. On the other hand, I find it disturbing to think about the voice that snuck into the recordings. "You can't escape." That phrase sounds in many urban legends as if the supernatural not only haunts us in cursed places, but can also follow us wherever we go. Is a disturbing reminder that sometimes terror doesn't end when we leave the place behind, but accompanies us in the Darkness of Our Own Minds. It began on a frigid November night. Emma Lozano, an investigative journalist known for her ability to unearth the most chilling truths, was driving down a lonely road on the outskirts of Hidalgo. Its destination, the San Isidro Sanatorium, a former psychiatric hospital shrouded in legends of tragedy and horror. The sanatorium had been abandoned more than 50 years ago, and its dark history made it the perfect setting for his last report on Mexico's most haunted places. Built in the late 19th century, the San Isidro Sanatorium had a grim reputation for its brutal methods of treatment. Forced isolation, electrozops, and the mysterious disappearance of patients had contributed to its legacy of terror. Rumors of experiments on the mentally ill added a nightmare air to the place. Locals claimed that the sanatorium was cursed, but Emma, skeptical, dismissed these stories as mere superstitions. As she approached, the silhouette of the building appeared in the cold light of the full moon. The Gothic-style structure stood imposingly with its pointed towers and windows like dark eyes. Emma parked her car in front of the rusty bars, her breath forming clouds in the icy air. Armed with her camera, flashlight, and tape recorder, she crossed the threshold with footsteps rustling on frost-covered leaves. The front doors, worn by time, they opened with a deep groan. Inside, the air was permeated with moo and decay. Graffiti and peeling paint covered the walls, but vestiges of her macabre past, rusty stretchers, broken ties persisted, and patient files scattered on the floor. Emma turned on her flashlight, her light cutting through the suffocating darkness. "They say that here the screams never stopped," she murmured, recording her voice on the recorder. Each room she explored told a story of abandonment and suffering. Beds with rotten mattresses, overturned furniture, and walls marked with messages of desperation to those who were restless in a corner of the room. Emma found a diary. The leather notebook was surprisingly well preserved, its pages filled with neat calligraphy that belonged to a patient named Margarita. "They come at night, they speak in whispers, but their eyes burn like embers. They're not human," she read out loud. A metallic noise echoed from the depths from the building. Paralyzed, the flashlight trembled in her hand as she scans the empty hallway. "Hello, there's someone there." Her voice bounced off the walls. Silence, attributing the noise to some animal. Emma continued. Although her heart was beating faster and faster, she decided to go down to the basement where, according to rumors, the isolation ward was located. There they had locked the most disturbed patients in tiny, dark cells for weeks on end. As she descended the rotten wooden stairs, the air became colder, almost unbreathable. The basement was a long corridor and silent, with iron doors on both sides. Emma peered into a cell. The walls were covered with words like "help" and "there is no way out." Her tape recorder picked up a faint sound, a prolonged and heartbreaking wail that was increasing. "Who's there?" Emma asked, her broken voice. The lament stopped, followed by a deadly silence. Instinct told her to get out of there, but her determination to discover the truth kept her going. Firm at the end of the corridor in the last cell, she found a medical chair with leather straps around it. Symbol etched on the floor seemed to form a ritual. She took out her camera and took some photographs, feeling that something invisible was watching her. Suddenly her flashlight flickered and went off. "No, no, now," she whispered, trying to change the batteries. Darkness enveloped her. When she managed to turn it on again, she saw him. Elongated and distorted figures were in the background. From the corridor they looked human, but their limbs were unnatural, and they began to move towards her. Emma ran up the stairs in fits and starts, while the aurochs and footsteps resounded behind her. The sanatorium seemed to come to life. Cultural laughter, doors closing, and distant screams followed her at every step. When she reached the main entrance, she discovered to her horror that the doors were closed. "Let me out," she screamed, knocking desperately behind her. One of the figures she brought her face closer. It was a threat of suffering, her eyes two unfathomable voids. Emma threw her flashlight and ran to a nearby office, barred the door with a filing cabinet. There she found a file entitled Patient Zero. It spoke of an experimental procedure intended to clarify disturbed minds. The result had been catastrophic. The patient died violently, and shortly thereafter the staff began to see shadows and experience unexplained phenomena. A knock on the door made her to return to reality. The figures were trying to enter. Emma found a ventilation shaft and slid through it, reaching the infirmary. Surgical tools and bloodstains covered the tables. She felt a cold hand that held her ankle and screamed, struggling until she freed herself. "Stay with us," whispered a desperate spectral voice. Ran towards the chapel. The place was different, solemn, and almost intact. On the altar, a huge mirror reflected her image, but she was not alone. Dozens of shadowy figures rose behind her with eyes gone like embers. The mirror cracked with a deafening bang. The figures slowly advanced, their voices creating a roar impossible to comprehend. Emma fell to her knees sobbing. Suddenly a reaper light filled the chapel. The shadows receded. Emma looked up and saw a priest, a luminous and peaceful figure standing on the altar. "You must leave," she said in a firm voice. "There, tied to this place, but you can still escape." The chapel doors opened. They opened and a path lit by the moon appeared. Emma ran without looking back. When she finally got to her car, she looked in the rearview mirror. The sanatorium was still there, her dark silhouette under the moon, with windows that seemed to look at her. Days later, when she reviewed her recordings, she heard voices and laughter that she didn't remember her photos. They showed impossible shadows. Although terrified, she knew that she had captured something extraordinary. Emma never returned to the sanatorium of San Isidro, but something in her had changed. She wrote her article, omitting details that no one would believe. The place is still abandoned, with its secrets trapped between the walls, along with the souls that never managed to escape. This story made me think about how terrifying abandoned places can be, not only because of their stories, but because of what they recall in our minds. I once visited an old closed hospital, and although I knew there was no one there, every shadow and every sound seemed to come to life. It's impressive how our mind can fill the void with its own horrors, as if the walls themselves kept the echoes of past suffering. Emma's story also leads me to reflect on the obsession of some journalists and urban explorers to discover the unknown at a cost of your own sanity or security. Sometimes there are doors that are better left closed because what is behind it may not want to be found. In particular, the symbols and rituals that the story mentions remind me of ancient forbidden practices where the boundary between science and the supernatural became blurred. Who knows how many times those experiments like that of Patient Zero released something that should never have existed. Finally, I can't help to ask me if the priest that Emma saw was real or an illusion created by the sanatorium itself, as if the place played with her perception. Perhaps that saving light was a last remnant of her own willpower to escape. The most disturbing thing is that many times when leaving places like this, a part of us is left behind, trapped with the souls that never managed to find peace. For decades, the building had been located on the outskirts of a small forgotten town in the state of Hidalgo, shrouded in a persistent fog that seemed to cling to its cracked walls like a shroud. Samuel had always felt a peculiar attraction for places like ruins impregnated with mystery and shadows, remains of forgotten lives. Was a paranormal investigator, and while his YouTube channel had a small but loyal audience tonight, he planned to do a live stream exploring the dreaded asylum. The building was imposing, its brick facade covered in moss and worn down from years of neglect, vines clinging to the walls, its dry branches looking like claws scratching the broken windows above the arched entrance, faded letters barely managing to spell San Isidro Psychiatric Hospital. Samuel adjusted his camera, his breath visible in the cold air, and stepped inside. The air inside was thick, laden with the smell of rot and dampness. Peeling paint hung on the walls like grotesque streamers, and broken furniture were strewn across the floor. Hellas of light from his lantern cut through the darkness, revealing graffiti painted in strident colors, warnings, prayers, and symbols. CRP Samuel narrated softly in front to the camera, his voice firm despite the chill that began to run through the body. San Isidro was closed in the mid-70s, after allegations of abuse and neglect came to light. It is said that patients here were subjected to inhumane treatments, lobotomies, electrotherapy, prolonged isolation. Some believe that their souls are still around here, trapped forever. Let's see if we find any evidence. Samuel, he advanced slowly, each step resounding in the absolute silence of the place. His flashlight illuminated walls with cracks that looked like veins, and on the floor dark spots suggested something he preferred not to imagine. In the distance, a broken window let a cold wind filter in that howled softly as if the building were breathing. His footsteps echoed as he advanced through the dark corridors. Each room told a story of suffering. Rusty beds with straps still hanging from closets and medical records scattered on the floor. In the air floated a faint smell of moo and something metallic that he could not identify. In a corner of the hallway, an old dentist's chair remained with worn runs and stains that looked like rust. But Samuel knew that the story of the asylum said otherwise. The numbers of viewers on his live broadcast increased as more people they joined in, commenting with a mixture of excitement and fear. Then a soft but clear sound, A bland like the cry of a child in the distance, Samuel stopped in secco, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The sound still far away seemed to come from further inside the building. Although the walls distorted it, making it sound as if it came from everywhere, they heard that, he whispered, directing the camera to where the sound seemed to be coming. The chat exploded with messages. Yes, it was. Heard, this is very creepy, get out of there. Plucking up courage, Samuel followed the sound down a long corridor. The doors on both sides were open as if someone had recently pushed them. The room seemed more messy here, with tattered mattresses and children's drawings scribbled on the walls. Some showed dark figures with large eyes and empty faces. The crying intensified more and more insistent at the end of the corridor. A half-open double door led to what appeared to be the nursery. She crossed the threshold, gasping for breath. Small metal beds lined the walls, her mattresses worn and stained in the center of the room. A wheelchair was motionless, its wheels slightly crooked. The crying ceased. "Hello," Samuel called, his voice reverberating in the unnatural silence. "There is someone here." An intense cold ran through the living room and the flashlight flicker. Samuel slammed it against his palm, stabilizing the ace of light, but the air had changed. It felt dense, charged with an invisible but palpable presence. He carefully approached the wheelchair. Just as he was about to touch it, the chair moved backwards on its own. Squeaking in an Adora, Samuel jumped back, almost letting go of the camera, his heart, the ant width as he frantically lit up the room. There was no one there. Don't invent salt from there. What's going on? Samuel managed to control his breathing and noticed something strange on the floor. Under a bed, a piece of yellowish paper was sticking out. He bent down to pick it up. It was a drawing. A small boy standing next to a tall, hunched figure hovering over him. The shadow had an elongated face with a deformed smile and eyes. Empty spaces at the bottom of the drawing scrawled in children's letters. A word paralyzed him. Margarita. Her flashlight shook again, and a thunderous noise echoed in the hallway. "I've always thought that abandoned places, especially those with a history as dark as an old asylum, retain something of their past. It's not just the echo of the stories we know, but the energy of everything that happened there. As if the walls could keep secrets. It is impossible for me not to imagine what those rooms must have seen. People overwhelmed in their suffering, subjected to inhumane treatments in the name of medicine. Perhaps it is not the ghosts that frighten us, but the reflection of human cruelty that is still felt. On Tulpa, entities that according to some beliefs take shape from our own fears and thoughts. If you think about it, a place like the San Isidro Asylum is the perfect breeding ground for something like this. Years of suffering, accumulated fear, and the human mind interpreting the unknown. Sometimes what we hear or think we see can be a real echo of trapped souls or something that we have brought with us without realizing it. The rain fell relentlessly, hitting the cracked pavement of a forgotten road that wound between dark hills and twisted trees. At the end of that desolate road rose the ruins of the sanatorium, the summit of silence, a structure of Rueda that had been abandoned more than 40 years ago. Its little sill cut through the blackness of the night like the irregular edge of a knife shrouded in mist and decay. The place had been for decades the center of local legends, rumors that spoke of shadows that wandered in the corridors and screams that could be heard in the early mornings, but no one confirmed it. It was just another forbidden place where the brave played to challenge the supernatural. Julian Martinez, a professor of history at the University of Querétaro, did not believe in any of that. He had been generating myths and urban superstitions in his classes and lectures for him. The summit of the silence was another made-up tale, one more page in the book of popular fantasies. Yet that night he found himself right in front of the iron bars of the sanatorium. With a flashlight, a digital recorder, and the stubbornness of a skeptic determined to find the truth, pushed open the rusty door that he complained with a squeak of heartbreaking, as if the place itself exhaled a warning. Julian stopped for an instant. From his lantern the light cut through the dense mist, illuminating the path covered with mud and undergrowth. The air was permeated with the smell of damp earth and something else, a rancid smell of rottenness before him. The sanatorium stood imposingly. Its main entrance resembled the mouth of a sleeping creature. Built in the 1920s, it had once been a refuge for the disturbed, as announced by old pamphlets. Without, however, decades turned it into a place of torture disguised as treatments. Unexplained disappearances and deaths that were never thoroughly investigated. It finally closed its doors in 1978 under circumstances as murky as the stories that still did not surround Julian crossed the threshold and entered the main hall. The sound of his boots resounded in the silence like a gunshot. The air inside the building was colder, almost icy. The light of his flashlight revealed the peeling wallpaper and graffiti that decorated the rotten walls. Phrases such as, "Get out," "Vanos," and "Get out" were scrawled in irregular letters written by desperate hands in times impossible to pin down. He advanced slowly down the central corridor where everything seemed a reminder of the forgotten existence of the sanatorium. The remains of overturned chairs, rusty filing cabinets, and spilled medicines formed a scene of abandonment. Julian crouched down at the sight of an old file. The label on the cover was yellowish, but the name was still legible, Leonor Castillo, and a note that said, "Violent delusions, dangerous subject." Before he could read more, a slight noise made him raise his head, a dragging like of footsteps that slid on the ground a few meters from him. Julian froze. His hands held the flashlight tighter. "There is someone there," he said in loud voice, his tone calm although he felt his heart racing. The corridor did not respond, only silence, so thick that it was almost palpable. Julian shook his head and forced himself to move forward, discarding the sound as a product of his imagination. The doors of the rooms on both sides of the corridor were open. Some hung on their hinges as if something had forced them years ago. The names on small metal plates were still there. Time had almost completely erased the letters. He arrived at what was once the common room, a large space where the walls were decorated with worn murals of country landscapes. The paint slid like tears, creating distorted shapes. In one corner there was an old piano, one of those that had been pried in better times. The wood was black and cracked, but the keys were still distinguishable under the layer of. Julian approached by stretching out his hand almost unintentionally. But before his fingers touched the instrument, a single note resounded, clear and piercing, as if someone had pressed a key from beyond. He jumped back, pointing the flashlight at the piano that remained motionless. His breathing was rapid and he felt his skin bristling. "There are no ghosts here," he murmured, trying to calm himself, but the temperature around him dropped suddenly. The vapor of his breath became visible, and then he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Turned abruptly, directing the flashlight to the other end of the room. Ellis DeLue stopped at a female figure, barely visible in the shadows. She was still, her head slightly tilted as if studying her movements. "She needs help," Julian shouted, trying to sound authoritative although her voice trembled a little. The figure did not respond. She just stood there motionless, but before she could take another step she disappeared, dissolving like smoke in the darkness. Julian swallowed hard. Feeling cold sweat ran down his back. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned on the digital recorder he carried in his jacket pocket. "Possible sighting," he murmured in a low, broken voice. "Female figure unresponsive. Disappears when he focuses on it." The echo of his own voice seemed to multiply in the empty room, as if the walls whispered his words back for a few seconds. Everything was in absolute silence, a silence so thick that even his heartbeat reverberates in his head. However, the instinct of a rational teacher drove him to continue. "It's nothing more than a shadow," he said as if he were convincing himself. "Maybe an optical effect. The mind plays tricks." While still looking at where the figure had disappeared, Julian crossed the room, illuminating every corner with a flashlight. The light flickered from time to time as if the battery he began to fail. Even though he had replaced it before going out to the back, he found a door ajar leading to a new hallway. The atmosphere was even more oppressive. Every step he took reverberated in an endless echo, as if someone else was following him. At the end of the corridor, a rusty metal plate indicated the next place, infirmary. Julian pushed the door cautiously, and a high-pitched screech made the door shutter. Place it looked like a sanctuary of abandonment. The stretchers were arranged in messy rows, covered in dust and dark stains. At the bottom, a metal shelf still held a few glass jars filled with coagulated and opaque liquids. Julian focused on one of them with his flashlight. He couldn't help but feel nauseous when he distinguished the contents. Human teeth floating as if they were forgotten pieces of some macabre ritual. "What the hell?" did he mutter, taking a step back. It was then that he heard a low, deep guttural sound coming from a corner of the room. The flashlight illuminated the source of the noise, an antique wheelchair with one of its wheels spinning slowly. Although no one was touching it, the chair seemed to be in the same place where a shadow had fallen. For decades Julian felt a chill run through his whole body. Ono breathed and forced himself to move. Common sense told him to leave that cursed place, but his curiosity was still stronger. He approached the shelf and noticed a dusty notebook bound in blackened leather. When he opened it, he saw handwritten notes with an irregular and frantic voice. The text was a mixture of medical reports and disjointed sentences, almost as if someone had written it in a state of trance. Patient 24. Severe regression. Refuses to speak. Sunken eyes. Empty gaze. Hears voices in the walls. The solution will be applied at dawn. Must never come out. The last sentence was underlined several times so strongly that he had pierced the paper. They should never come out. Suddenly a current of cold air hit the room and the pages of the notebook shook violently. Julian's flashlight flickered twice and went out completely. The darkness was immediate and total. Did not exclaim Julian, hitting the flashlight against his leg, trying to turn it on again, but it didn't respond. He took out his phone, looking for the flashlight function, and turned it on with trembling hands. The dim light illuminated just enough for him to see around him. The wheelchair was no longer in place. It was right in front of him. "This is not real," he whispered, his voice breaking. But then a dozen silhouettes appeared in the shadows. They were blurred humanoid figures, still as if the shapes didn't have faces, just distorted outlines that seemed to tremble as the light from the phone tried to focus on them. Julian's pulse ran wild. He stepped back awkwardly, bumping into a stretcher and throwing the old notebook to the ground. Murmurs began to invade the silence, at first soft as sighs, but little by little they became clearer. "You shouldn't have come. You can't leave. Listen to what we did." Voices overlapped, rumbling on the walls, and inside his head Julian felt that his legs were not responding. Fear had him paralyzed. Finally he gathered strength and ran to the door, pushing it with all his weight. The corridor he returned to was different. The walls were clean, the lights on, and the smell of disinfectant replaced the rottenness. It was as if he had gone back in time. "What the hell?" he babbled, unable to understand what he saw. From at the other end of the hallway, a man appeared, walking towards him, wearing a white coat like a doctor and a mask that hid his face. His steps were slow and methodical, and in one hand he held a syringe that dripped a dark liquid. "You shouldn't be here," said the man in a calm but cold voice that echoed throughout the room. Julian wanted to scream, but no sound came out of his throat. Julian couldn't move. His body seemed to be nailed to the ground, his mind in absolute terror. The man in the white coat continued to move forward slowly, the sound of his footsteps resounding like hammer blows in the silent corridor. The syringe dripping in his hand seemed to absorb all of Julian's attention. "You shouldn't be here," the man repeated, his voice deep like an echo coming from a bottomless pit. With a superhuman effort, Julian managed to take a few steps back. His phone was still emitting a faint light, but at that instant it began to vibrate as if an incoming call was shaking him. Without thinking, he took it out of his pocket and looked at the screen. The call was coming from an unknown number. The vibration abruptly ceased and a voice began to sound from the speakerphone. "Why did you come back?" Julie was the voice of a whispering and broken woman, but Clara, as if she were on the other side of the aisle. The screen of the began to distort, and before he could react the device went out. The light disappeared completely. The only thing that remained was the figure of the man, approaching slowly but inevitable. "Don't get closer," Julian shouted with a trembling voice, but the doctor did not stop. The syringe dripped one last drop before the man extended his free hand towards him. Suddenly a rumble made them both turn the head, a metallic sound as if a door had slammed shut somewhere in the building. The light returned for an instant, flickering and faint, and the man in the robe disappeared in an instant, dissolving into shadows that crawled towards the walls. Julian Jade, regaining control of his legs, seized the moment and began to run down the hallway, did not stop to look back. He only listened to the echo of his own footsteps and the frantic roar of his breathing. The lights flickered as he moved forward, as if the sanitarium itself was trying to stop him. As he turned corner after corner, the corridor seemed endless, each turn leading him back into a corridor just as long, identical, as if he were trapped in a twisting maze and changing to "This can't be happening. This isn't real," he repeated quietly as a desperate mantra. It was then that he heard it. A soft woman's song was a mournful, almost childlike melody that came from the end of one of the corridors. Julian stopped at Secco. The singing enveloped him. The blood was soft but seemed to be full of pain. Pushed by an impulse he did not understand, he went towards the source of the sound. Finally he reached a double door of worn wood, but still solid. On it, a rusty plaque said "Intensive Care Room, Julian." Swallowed hard and pushed open the door. The room was large and rectangular. dimly lit by natural light filtering through broken planks in the windows. In the center of the room a figure sat on an antique wheelchair. It was the same woman who had seen her frail, thin silhouette before. With straight black hair falling like a veil over her face, Julian raised the lantern that miraculously turned on again. Waves of light illuminated her figure. The woman was wearing what appeared to be a patient gown and stained. Her head was tilted to one side and her hands rested inert on her lap. "Who are you?" Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper. The woman did not respond. Slowly she began to raise her face. When she did, Julian felt that the air left his lungs. His eyes were empty, completely white, and 2 threads of tears ran down his cheeks. "Help us," murmured the woman in a broken voice. Julian took a step back, but something stopped him. Around the room, dozens of figures began to materialize. From the shadows, they were patient, their bodies thin and deformed, with the same worn robes, and the empty eyes remained standing, motionless, watching him. "They forgot us," they said, their voices resounding in the air like a distant roar. The floor began to vibrate beneath his feet. The light of the lantern grew weaker and the whole room seemed to writhe. Julian stepped back until his back hit the door. Paz screamed desperately. The woman in the wheelchair raised her hand slowly, pointing towards him. "You are just like them. You shouldn't have come in here." Before he could answer, a sharp pain went through him, as if something invisible oppressed him. Intensified, and the room began to darken until everything was black. Julian woke up suddenly. His face pressed against the cold and dusty floor. The pain in his chest had disappeared, but his body felt numb, as if he had spent hours around him. The intensive care room was empty. There was no sign of the woman or the figures that had surrounded him. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his heart that was still beating frantically. It was all a hallucination, he murmured, trying to convince himself. Although his voice sounded broken and hollow, the flashlight was lying next to him, Malager, lightly lit. He picked it up and looked at him. Everything around him seemed darker and quieter than before. It was then that he noticed something strange. A shadow longer than the others was projected on the wall in front of him. Julian turned slowly, and his flashlight illuminated what was behind. The figure of the doctor with the syringe was there again, motionless in the center of the room, as if he had never been there. This time he was not alone. Around him, patients, the same misshapen and empty-eyed figures, were standing watching him in silence. "You can't leave." The doctor's voice echoed in the room without his lips moving. "Enough. Let me out," Julie shouted, running towards the double door. But no matter how he pulled, he pushed the door. He didn't give way. He seemed fused with the wall behind him. The voices of the patients began to rise, a chorus of wails and accusations. "They locked us up here. They forgot us. Don't leave us alone." Julian turned the flashlight, trembling in his hand. The figures began to move forward slowly, approaching him with rigid and unnatural movements. Desperation did not consume. He frantically looked for another way out, but there was nothing. Then something in his mind clicked. "This is not real," he whispered more to himself. "This is just a bad dream. They are not real." But the figures kept getting closer and closer. The air in the room became unbreathable, so dense that it was like inhaling liquid lead. Suddenly he felt a strange heat in his chest. He looked down and saw that the recorder he still carried in his pocket emitted a faint sound, a distorted crack, as if it were picking up something. The recorder began to play the voices. "Help us, don't leave us here." The sound increased, mixing with the roar of the figures that made it. July squeezed the floor with all his might. "I'm not responsible for you. I didn't do this," he shouted. The floor began to shake, the walls cracked, and a deafening roar shook the room. The figures screamed in unison, and the light of the flashlight burst into a flash. Everything vanished when Julian opened his eyes again. He was lying outside the sanatorium in front of the rusty bars. The sky was still covered with black clouds and rain was pouring down, soaking his body. His flashlight was broken and the tape recorder rested next to him. Completely useless, he sat up. Slowly, feeling his legs weak, as if he could barely stand up, he looked at the building. The sanatorium was still there, dark and in ruins, but something inside him seemed different. An absolute silence enveloped him, as if the place had been empty or satisfied. Without looking back, Julian stumbled to his car, starting the engine with trembling hands, drove away from the sanatorium at full speed, without stopping even to catch his breath. Days later, sitting in his office at the university, Julian reviewed the material he had managed to recover. The recorder was burnt and the flashlight did not work, but on his phone a single audio file had been left intact. although he would swear that he never recorded it. When he played it, an indescribable cold ran through it. It was the sound of the voices. Why you came back? You can't leave. You should never have gone in at the end of the file, just before it was cut off. One last voice could be heard clear and calm, the doctor's voice. We'll see you soon, Julian. Julian slammed the file shut and turned off the phone for whole nights. He couldn't sleep. Sometimes when the wind was blowing hard or the rain hit his window, it seemed to him, listen of those voices, they always said the same thing. Don't forget us. No one set foot in the sanatorium again. The Cumber del Silencio. Weeks later it was demolished, but the rumors persisted. The nearby inhabitants assured that on the darkest nights whispers were heard that the wind brought. From where the building used to be, Julia never spoke of the place again, but something in her eyes changed forever because she had understood a truth impossible to ignore. There is places that do not want to be covered. The figure of the doctor with the syringe is particularly disturbing. It makes me think of those inhuman treatments that were applied in the name of science, such as lobotomies and electrodes. The most terrifying thing is that in places like these, the line between the human and the monstrous is blurred. I imagine Julian facing not only the supernatural, but also the vestiges of a system that preferred to hide the weak and sick, condemning them to oblivion. Finally, the echo of the voices asking for help or warning not to enter is something that resonates deeply, and if in those abandoned spaces in some way a conscience remains trapped, they may not be ghosts in the traditional sense, but memories that refuse to disappear. Places like this seem to remind those who visit them that there are sorrows that are never fully buried, and that through sometimes it's better not to try to dig them up. Thank you for joining me on this journey full of stories. If you liked it, leave your like and subscribe to not miss more horror stories, and remember, in the description you will find links to everything you need, our official store, the Members Club for early access and exclusive content, and much more. I am the narrator, and we will see you very soon in the shadows. The full moon is reflected in the murky waters of the San Miguel River in a small town forgotten between hills and fog. That place hidden from the world carried with it a legend that crossed generations. La Llorona, however, for the inhabitants of the town, it was not just a story that was whispered between lit candles and pressed rosaries. It was a warning. Laura, a young teacher, recently arrived from the city. She accepted a temporary job at the local school at the age of 27 years, and a restless spirit saw the move as an opportunity to escape from her own personal ghosts. She rented a small cabin near the river despite Dona Rosario's warnings. The old woman in charge of renting the houses do not go near the river at night, Miss Laura said with her eyes clouded with fear. There she cries. There she looks for her children. Laura smiled kindly and thanked her for the advice. She gave too much importance to her. They were village stories. The first week passed without incident. Laura adapted to her routine, teaching in the mornings, exploring the market in the afternoons, and reading by the window at night. But the calm was broken. One morning a pitiful cry woke her up. She got out of bed with her heart beating wildly. She looked out the window, but only saw the endless darkness and the reflection. The weeping was soft but clear, as if a woman were sobbing near the shore. There must be someone hurt, she muttered to herself, took a flashlight and went out, feeling the cold biting her skin. The dirt road creaked under her feet, and the wind brought with it a smell of stagnant water. When she reached the shore, she was seen by a figure dressed in white with long wet hair covering her. Her face was standing on a rock. "Lady, she's fine?" Laura asked in a trembling voice. The figure slowly turned her head, and her empty eyes, dark as the night itself, were fixed on her. The scream that emerged from that mouth was heartbreaking, a mixture of pain and fury that the young woman's blood, the H, staggered back and ran back to the cabin, closed the door tightly, threw the listen to the lament that was still resounding in the air. The next day she went straight to see Dona Rosario. She saw her, right? The old woman asked without the need for explanations. Laura felt unable to speak. She doesn't seem by chance a teacher. La Llorona doesn't let herself be seen unless she wants something from you. That night Laura couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed with a lit candle and a crucifix in her hands. However, the lament came back, this time closer, this time inside the cabin. The air became heavy, the cold unbearable. Laura felt a whisper next to her ear. "My children, give me back my children." Laura screamed and ran towards the village, knocked on the door of the church until Father Ramiro opened it. "She spoke to me. She was inside, from my house." The priest nodded gravely and offered her refuge inside the temple, there under the faint light of the Syrians. Laura heard the full story. The legend of the Weeping Woman was not just a tale. More than 100 years ago, a woman named Mary, blinded by jealousy and her husband's abandonment, drowned her own children in the river. Realizing the horror she had committed, she threw herself into it, to the water, but her soul was trapped between this world and the next, condemned to look for her children eternally. But there is something more, Father Ramiro said. She looks for replacements every so often. She takes someone with her. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. That night, a group of men from the village armed with flashlights and rosaries accompanied Laura back to her cabin to collect her things. However, when they arrived, they found something that had watermarks in the shape of bare feet. She can no longer stay here, teacher, said one of the men. She has already marked her. Laura, he left the town that same night. Father Ramiro, he gave her a crucifix and a small bottle of holy water. Don't look back again. Daughter, she is always close to those she has chosen. Laura never returned to the village, but sometimes on the quietest nights she still hears that heartbreaking lament in her dreams. Oh, my children, in a small town on the edge of Lake Sacamilco, where the fog creeps in on the water like a ghostly veil at nightfall. Stories are told that freeze blood. Among all of them, there is one that no one dares to tell out loud after midnight. The story of La Llorona. Maria, a young single mother of 26 years old, she had decided to move to the village with her son Emilio, a 6-year-old boy with large and curious eyes. Maria sought to escape the noise and the chaos of the city. His uncle Jose had offered him a small cabin on the shores of the lake that, according to him, was ideal for starting over. The first night passed quietly, although Maria could not help but feel restless. The wind blew strongly against the wooden windows, and the reflection of the moon on the lake gave the water a silver glow that was hypnotic. Emilio slept soundly, clutching his teddy bear, but it was on the second night when it all started. At 3 in the morning, a heartbreaking wail cut the silence. Oh, my children. It was heard in the distance. Maria opened her eyes suddenly, with her heart beating hard in her chest. She got up carefully, so as not to wake Emilio, and approached the window. Outside, the fog was so thick that she could barely see the lake. Must be the wind, she muttered to calm down. However, to go back to bed, she heard wet footsteps just outside the front door. The crackling paralyzed her. She remained motionless for what seemed like hours, until the sounds disappeared. The next day, Maria went to the village market to buy provisions. As she went through the stalls, an old herb seller was staring at her. You shouldn't live so close to the lake, girl, the old woman said in a deep voice. Why does she say it? Maria asked, feeling a chill run down her spine. Because she walks on those shores. She looks for her children, although she will never find them. Maria returned home with a feeling of tightness in her chest. That night she tried to convince Emilio to sleep in the same room as her, but the boy insisted on staying in his room. At 3 in the morning, the lament returned. Oh, my children. This time Maria, he could not ignore it. He walked slowly to Emilio's room and opened the door. The boy was asleep, but his window was wide open, and a figure dressed in white was outlined on the shore of the lake. The figure was tall, with a torn dress and long black hair covering his face. His hands held something invisible, as if he were trying to carry a child who was no longer there. He did not scream. Maria, running to the window to close it. The figure slowly turned her head, and sunken eyes, black as obsidian, were fixed on her. A heart-rending scream came from the throat of the spectral woman before vanishing into the fog. That night Maria didn't last. At dawn, she packed her things and decided to leave town with Emilio. But when she tried to start her car, the engine wouldn't respond. We can't stay here, Maria whispered. She decided to walk with Emilio to her Uncle Jose's house, but the road that led to the town seemed endless. The fog did not dissipate, and a smell of stagnant water permeated the air. Suddenly she let go of her mother's hand. Mommy, she is calling me. Maria felt as if the world stopped. Whose son? The lady in white tells me to accompany her. Maria looked ahead and saw the figure of La Llorona standing in the middle of the road. Her arms were outstretched and her mouth deformed in an eternal lament. Don't look at her. Emilio closes his eyes, took his son in his arms and ran as fast as he could, but the wailing seemed to follow her. Oh, my children finally arrived at Jose's house. The man greeted them with a pale expression and allowed them to enter, closed the door with several bolts. They can't stay here, Jose said firmly. That thing has marked them. They have to go far, far away from this place. That same afternoon, Jose managed to repair Maria's car. Mother and son left without looking back while the sun set on the horizon. Years later, Maria could never forget those empty eyes or the sound of that lament that still visits her in her dreams. Lake Sacamilco continues to be a place where the fog covers ancient secrets and where every night a soul in pain continues to wander looking for her children. Night had fallen on San Isidro, a small town hidden among mountains in northern Mexico. The air smelled of damp earth, and the cicadas sang a monotonous refrain interrupted from time to time by the rustling of dry branches under the feet of a nocturnal animal. Mariana, a young woman of 27 years old, had just returned to the village after years of absence. Her grandmother had died 2 weeks ago, and although the burial had already passed, there was still unfinished business with the old family casona near the river. That house with yellowish walls and broken tile roofs. She kept more than memories. She kept secrets. Don't go to the river at night, Mariana warned her. Dona Cata, the neighbor across the street, an old woman hunched over with trembling hands. They say that she comes back when the moon is full. Mariana smiled kindly but didn't answer. She didn't believe in those stories. She had heard the legends of La Llorona since she was a child, but for her they were nothing more than stories to scare the little ones. At midnight a noise woke her up. It was a distant sound like a wail. Blown by the wind, she got out of bed and walked to the window. From there she could see the river shining under the pale moonlight. Surely it is the wind, she murmured to herself, but the lament continued clearer and clearer. Oh, my children! Mariana felt a chill run down her spine. The sound not of the wind or of some animal was a desperate human voice. The river seemed to call her without thinking much. She put a jacket over her shoulders and went out into the cold of the night. When she reached on the shore, she saw something that took her breath away. A silhouette. Blanca was standing in the middle of the water with her long wet hair covering her face. Mariana exclaimed with a thread of voice. You're fine. The figure didn't answer. She just stood there still, with her head down. The water around her feet seemed completely motionless, as if time had stopped at that precise moment. Suddenly the figure slowly raised his face. His eyes were two dark hollows, deep, filled with a void impossible to describe. Mariana felt that her breath was missing. Her legs trembled and she took a step back, but she stumbled and fell backwards on the wet grass. The lament was heard again, this time much closer, so close that she felt the icy breath of that voice next to her ear. Oh, my children! Mariana screamed, and she closed her eyes tightly when she opened them again. The figure was no longer there. The river continued to flow calmly as if nothing had happened. Trembling, she stood up and ran back to the house, but before entering she felt one last look fixed on the back of her neck, as if something or someone was watching her from the darkness of the river. She locked the door and dropped to the ground panting, but the worst was yet to come. That night Mariana did not sleep, and at dawn she found something strange in the doorframe. Small wet footprints that were moving away towards the river. The dawn dyed the hills of San Isidro orange, but the sunlight did not dissipate the cold that had settled on Mariana's body. The small wet footprints in front of the door were still there, like a silent trail that was pointing directly at the river. It can't be, she murmured in a trembling voice, determined not to be dominated by fear. She took a broom and erased the footprints, but the feeling of being watched did not disappear. When she went out to the small backyard of the casona, she saw something else on a stone. Just at the edge of the river, there was a small red ribbon, dirty and worn like the ones that girls used to wear in their braids. The memory of her grandmother came suddenly when she was a child. Her grandmother told her about a mother who, out of desperation and madness, had thrown her children into the river on a stormy night. Then, regretful, she had taken her own life. But her spirit never found rest, and every night she returned to the river crying and looking for her lost children. They are stories, only stories, it was said, but her voice lacked firmness. That day Mariana decided to visit Dona Cata, who seemed to know more than she was saying, crossed the narrow stone path that separated the houses and knocked on the door of the old woman. Pass, girl, answered the harsh voice from inside. Dona Cata was sitting in a rocking chair with a woven blanket covering her legs. Her sunken eyes, but full of a strange clarity, were fixed on Mariana's. You know something. Truth about what happens in the river? Mariana asked, almost in a whisper. The old woman sighed and nodded slowly. La Llorona is not just a story, girl, it's a warning. My mother heard it when I was just a baby, and her mother before her. Not everyone can see her, but you paused, studying Mariana's face. You were called. Why? I answered Mariana with a knot in her throat. The river, the flame, to those who have a wounded soul, someone who keeps a sorrow a secret or a regret. You have something too. Confessed girl Dona Kata bowed her head, waiting for an answer. Mariana lowered her gaze. There was something in her chest that weighed for years, something that she always avoided facing, but it was not time to talk about it. No, I don't know. She finally replied, be careful, Mariana. If the spirit has seen, will try to take you with her. Dona Kata's eyes shone with a mixture of compassion and fear. Don't go near the river tonight. No matter what. Mariana returned to the casona with her stomach in a knot. She tried to occupy herself with simple tasks. Sweeping, washing the dishes, checking her grandmother's old documents. But as the sun set behind the mountains, an invisible oppression filled every corner of the house. When darkness took over the town, Mariana turned on all the lights, but the electric light barely. He could overcome the shadows that accumulated in the corners at midnight. The silence was broken again. Oh, my children! The scream was much clearer, this time much closer. Mariana covered his ears, but the sound seemed to go through the walls, the ceiling. His skin was a lament that was not only heard, it was suddenly felt. Something forced him to look at the window that looked out of the river. There it was, the same white silhouette, motionless in the dark waters, with her arms outstretched towards the sky and her hair covering her face. But this time the figure spoke. Her voice was a distant echo, as if it came from another time, another world. You took them from me. Mariana stepped back, tripping over a chair and falling to the ground. Her breathing was erratic. Her heart was pounding hard inside her chest. It's not true. I didn't take you away. Nothing screamed, but her voice, as soon as it came out like a whisper. The little girl began to move slowly towards the shore, coming out of the water, her feet leaving wet footprints on the earth. Mariana ran to the front door, but found her stuck, as if something was blocking her from the outside. The lament was heard again, but this time behind her. Oh, my children! Mariana turned her head slowly and saw her. There she was, just a few minutes away. Meters away inside her house, with her arms outstretched and her face covered by strands of soaked black hair. Mariana screamed with all her strength, and then everything became dark. The cold was the first thing she felt when she regained consciousness. A wet, sticky cold, as if she were submerged in water. Mariana opened her eyes with difficulty. She was lying on the floor of the living room with wet cheeks and the heart beating, pounding in her temples. The house was in heavy gloom outside. The wind whistled through the branches of the trees, but no other sound could be heard, neither crickets nor cicadas, nor the murmur of the river. What happened? She murmured as she tried to stand up. When she did so, she saw something that left her frozen on the ground. Right where she had fallen there was a puddle of water, but it was not a simple puddle. The water formed a path that went from where she was to the front door that was now ajar. Her legs trembled as she slowly approached outside. The moon shone on the river, but something else caught her attention. Wet footprints followed a trail that went down to the shore. No, it can't be, whispered her voice, barely audible. A part of her wanted to lock herself in her room and never leave again. But another, a deeper, older part forced her to follow that trail, as if an invisible force were guiding her. The air was icy outside, and the mist covered the path to the river like a spectral veil. Diana descended the cobblestone path. Her bare feet brushed the damp earth. Every step she took seemed to resonate inside her head. When she reached the shore she saw it. The river was motionless, almost crystalline under the moonlight, and in the middle of it the white figure of La Llorona stood with her arms drooping at her sides and her head tilted forward. Why are you following me? Mariana shouted with tears in her eyes. What do you want from me? The silhouette slowly raised its head. Its two empty black sockets shone faintly in the gloom. But this time La Llorona's voice was not a lamento, was a soft, close whisper, as if it were right behind her. They're not stories, Mariana. They're looking for you too. Mariana felt an emptiness in her chest, an abyss that swallowed her from within. She staggered backwards, and then she remembered a memory she'd buried years ago, one she'd tried to forget at all costs. It was a rainy afternoon many years ago. Mariana was driving down a winding road with two little ones in the back seat of their car. Their cousins Carlos and Sofia had taken them to the city at the request of their aunt, but the return was a nightmare. The rain was falling with fury, and the road was barely visible between the curtain of water. Aunt Mariana, I am afraid, Sofia had said with her trembling little voice. We are almost there, my love, she replied, trying to sound calm. But a second of distraction, a blink of an eye, a reflection in the windshield, and then the sound of the tires losing grip, the metal twisting and the cold water covering it. All the car fell into the river. Mariana managed to get out, but the little ones didn't. The current dragged them away, and although she searched desperately, she never found that memory, that guilt, That pain was her burden, and now because the weeping woman called her, because the river dragged her to its depths. No, it wasn't my guilt, whispered Mariana, falling to her knees in front of the river. I didn't want to. I couldn't save them. The whisper of La Llorona came back, this time with an almost maternal, almost compassionate tone. The river never forgets. Mariana never forgets. The water began to move slowly, forming waves that seemed to invite her without realizing it. Mariana began to walk towards the river with her arms outstretched, tears sliding down her face. Mariana, don't do it. Her strong voice made her stop. It was Dona Cata, who had arrived at the shore with a trembling flashlight in her hand. Don't listen to her words. Don't get carried away. Mariana blinked as if waking up from a dream. She looked at the water that now seemed to bubble under her feet, as if something was waiting for her down there. Come here, girl, Dona Cata shouted, extending a hand to her. Mariana slowly backed away and ran towards the old woman, who took her by the arm and led her away from the river. Behind them a heartbreaking scream tore through the air. Oh, children! The silhouette of the weeping woman began to fade as if it were smoke dissipating in the wind. Both women ran back to the hood, locked the door, and fell to the ground exhausted. The river almost took you, girl, Dona Cata murmured between gasps, but there is still something you can do. Mariana replied with tears still running down her cheeks. Forgiveness, Mariana, but not that of others. You need to forgive yourself. Silence fell on them like a heavy blanket outside. The river flowed calmly again, as if nothing had happened, but they both knew that it was not over yet. The dawn began to tinge with gold the hills of San Isidro, but inside the Casona the atmosphere was still dense, heavy, as if time had been suspended in the shadows of the previous night. Mariana and Dona Cata remained seated in the living room with trembling hands, clinging to their black coffee cups. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the soft clinking of spoons against the ceramics. Forgiveness, Mariana murmured with her gaze lost in the void. How can I forgive myself for something like this? How do you live with this? Dona Cata put her cup down on the table and looked at her with a firmness she hadn't shown until now. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. Mariana means accepting what happened, carrying it and finding a way to move on. But if you don't, the river will never leave you alone. She will never leave you alone. The old woman's words resounded in her head like an echo. Mariana slowly stood up and she walked to the window that looked out on the river. There in the distance the water shone calmly in the morning sun. But something inside her told her that the calm was only superficial. I have to go, she said suddenly with a determination that surprised Dona Cata herself. You're crazy, girl. You don't understand what happened last night. She almost can't live with this anymore, Dona Cata. If there's any way to end this, to find peace, I need to try. The old woman looked at her for a long moment and finally nodded sadly. May God be with you, Mariana. The river was calmer than ever when Mariana reached its shore. The wet stones shone under the sun, and the murmur of the water, it seemed like a soft, almost affectionate whisper. She knelt on the shore, feeling the cold mud between her fingers. She took a deep breath and closed. Carlos Sofia whispered with a broken voice, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I never wanted that to happen, I failed them, and I've carried this weight every day since then. Her tears fell silently, mixing with the crystal clear water of the river. The wind blew softly, moving her hair and bringing with it a barely perceptible sound, a soft bland like that of a mother comforting her children. I'm sorry, but I need to forgive myself. I need you to forgive me. The river remained calm, but something changed. The air became lighter, less oppressive. The cold he had felt since the first night began to fade. Then he saw it, two small shadows in the water holding hands, smiling from the reflection of the river. Carlos and Sofia. Thank you, Mariana murmured, bringing a hand to her chest. The figures slowly faded as if they were part of the water itself, leaving behind her a sense of peace that Mariana had not felt in years. Goodbye, whispered with a tear rolling down her cheek. The lament of La Llorona was not heard again that night or the following ones. The river continued to flow eternally, but she no longer called Mariana. Weeks later, Mariana decided to sell the Casona and leave San Isidro. Was not an act of escape, but of farewell. In the end, she understood that the river was not an enemy, but a mirror that had shown her her most painful truth. Before leaving, she visited Dona Cata for the last time. She looks calmer, girl, said the old woman with a tired smile. I am answering, Mariana. Thank you for everything. Dona Cata, the old woman nodded and took her hands. The river never forgets, Mariana, but sometimes also forgive. Mariana smiled softly. Then she turned around and began to walk along the path that would take her away from San Isidro. Behind her the river continued to flow, singing its eternal murmur between the stones. But this time that murmur was not a lament, it was a whisper of peace. The small town of Santa Esperanza, a place secluded among hills and shrouded in legends as old as its dirt roads, the streets normally silent were filled with the echo of the last church bells announcing midnight for the inhabitants was an implicit warning. No one should be outside at that time. Laura, a young single mother, adjusted the blankets around her son Samuel, barely 6 years old. They lived alone in a small house at the end of the town, near the arroyo that meandered like a silver scar under the moon. That night the little boy couldn't sleep. "Mom, it's true what they say of La Llorona?" Samuel asked with wide eyes. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. She had grown up listening to that story like everyone else in Santa Esperanza. A woman condemned to wander eternally looking for her children drowned by her own hand in a fit of madness and desperation are just stories to scare children. "My love now sleeps," she replied with a forced smile, but even Laura knew it wasn't a distant lament, a sound that didn't seem to come from any human being that night. After making sure Samuel slept soundly, Laura turned off the lamp and lay down on her bed. The silence, it became heavy, interrupted only by the murmur of the stream and the distant hoot of an owl. Suddenly a sound pierced the air, as subtle as a sigh, a weak bland, almost a moan. Laura straightened up suddenly. Her heart hammered, her chest tried to convince herself that it was the wind playing between the branches, but then she heard it again, this time clearer. "Oh, my children!" The moan was prolonged, plaintive, and seemed to come from the arroyo. Laura felt a knot in her stomach, got up slowly, and approached the window outside. The moon illuminated the landscape with a spectral clarity by the stream. A figure wrapped in a white dress and with long, dark hair seemed to float on the surface. "It cannot be," Laura murmured. The figure slowly raised her head, and although the distance prevented her from seeing her face, Laura felt that those empty eyes were looking directly at her. Suddenly a shrill scream, piercing, broke the stillness of the night. Laura stepped back, tripping over a chair and falling to the ground. Samuel woke up startled and ran to his mother. "Mom, what was that?" "Don't look out the window," Laura ordered, hugging him tightly. The bland outsides continued for several minutes until suddenly everything was silent, a heavy oppressive silence. Laura did not sleep the rest of the night. The next day in the town market, murmurs ran through the stalls. Don Anselmo, an old man who had lived all his life in Santa Esperanza, she commented last night she heard herself again. "La Llorona is close when she appears. There is always a tragedy." Laura felt a chill when she heard those words. She decided that she would not spend another night in that house. At dusk she packed some belongings and she took Samuel by the hand. "We will go to your Aunt Isabel's house in the center of town," she said firmly. However, when they were about to leave, a familiar sound stopped the same lament, this time just outside the door. "Oh, my children!" Laura backed away, paralyzed by fear. The door began to shake, as if something was pushing her from outside. "Mom, I am afraid." Samuel. Laura took her son in her arms and ran to the back of the house where there was a small exit to the stream, but when she opened the back door she found her. The figure was there just a few feet away. Her white clothes were soaked and covered with mud, and her face pale as wax had empty sockets where her eyes should be. "Give it to me! Give it to me! Give it to my son!" cried the apparition, in a voice that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. Laura stepped back, stumbling and falling to the ground with Samuel in her arms. La Llorona was slowly advancing towards them, her arms outstretched. "No, get away from them!" he shouted, Laura with tears in her eyes. At that moment the church bells rang announcing midnight. The figure stopped as if the sound hurt her with a deafening scream. She backed back towards the stream and disappeared into the mist. Laura ran towards the town with her son in her arms without looking back. That night they took refuge in the church where Father Ramiro offered them protection and consuelo. La Llorona did not. "You can enter consecrated land," said the priest solemnly at dawn. Laura decided to leave Santa Esperanza for good. She could not risk that entity returning for her son. They never returned to the town, but the story of Laura and Samuel was recorded in the memories of Santa Esperanza. The inhabitants continue to avoid the stream at night, and from time to time someone claims to have heard in the distance a lamento que yella the blood. "Oh, my children!" It was a dark night, like only nights in the small rural towns can be, in the heart of Michoacan, in the town of Zazuzan, a place surrounded by the imposing lake of Pecuaro. The breeze was soft but charged with an extra sensation, as if the air itself were lurking. The legend of the weeping woman had haunted the town for generations, and although many believed it was only a tale to scare children, others knew not to underestimate what is hidden in the deep waters of the lagoon. Eduardo, a 22-year-old who had recently arrived in town for a temporary job in a textile factory, had not heard of the legend, but soon realized that the locals spoke of her in whispers. The weeping woman, the woman dressed in white who she was crying over the death of her children. She was wandering the shores of the lake in search of their lost souls. No one had ever seen her up close, but the stories were so consistent that even for a skeptic like Eduardo, they were beginning to take shape. The first night he spent in the guest house where he was staying, something strange happened. He woke up startled, feeling a pressure in his chest, as if something invisible was watching him. At the window, the darkness was total, but he could hear a distant, broken cry as if someone was in pain. Eduardo uncomfortably tried to ignore it, but the sound persisted, approaching little by little. It must be an animal, he thought, falling back asleep although the cold ran through his skin. But the next day, while he was having breakfast, an old acquaintance of the owner of the house, Don Carlos, approached the table with a somber expression. "You heard last night?" he asked without further ado. Eduardo, surprised by the question, nodded slowly. "I listened to him, but what was it?" he said, trying to downplay the importance. Don, he stared at him. His begged face seemed even more serious. "La Llorona, she comes every night. The waters of the lake call her, and if one is unlucky enough to listen to her, she can be marked forever. They say that whoever hears her in the end takes her." Eduardo laughed, believing that the old man was joking. But when he saw Don Carlos's sincere gaze, a concern began to form in his stomach. Throughout the week, Eduardo tried to ignore the murmurs and cautious looks of the inhabitants of the town. However, that night the crying returned. This time it was not so far away. It seemed to be right at the water's edge, so close that you could clearly hear the pain of the voice. The crying was unmistakable, and Eduardo, determined to understand once and for all what was happening, left his room and walked towards the shore of the lagoon. The night was silent except for the sound of the wind and the waves that gently crashed against the shore as he approached the water. He felt a chill run through his body. The moon was at its highest, illuminating the landscape with its silver light, but there was not a single soul visible in the distance, only the crying, a deep and desperate cry. Suddenly something emerged from the water, a tall figure dressed entirely in white. Eduardo couldn't move a single muscle. The figure was walking towards him with an empty expression, as if he had no awareness of his surroundings. The wind seemed to intensify, and the crying, although soft at first, now grew louder and closer, filling the air with a sense of indescribable horror. "What are you looking for?" Eduardo asked in a trembling voice. The figure did not answer but stopped in front of him. Eduardo could see his face pale and disfigured, as if he had been underwater for days. His sunken and dark eyes stared at him, but there was no life in them, only empty. "My children," murmured the figure in a broken voice. Eduardo did not understand what the figure had said. He raised his hands to the sky, as if he were summoning something or someone. The crying intensified, resounding in the night. At that moment Eduardo felt an unbearable pressure on his chest, as if something was taking his life. Suddenly the air became cold and heavy. Eduardo, with his mouth dry and his heart attending forcefully or retreating, but his feet were nailed to the ground. It was like if an invisible force was holding him back. The figure began to walk slowly towards him, while the waters of the lake seemed to be churning around him. Eduardo wanted to scream, but he couldn't. Desperation did not invade at that moment. He remembered the words of Don Carlos. "If you hear her, if you see her, nothing will be the same." In a last effort to free himself from the pressure, Eduardo managed to move his feet and ran towards the house without looking back. He entered his room, closed the door in despair, and threw himself on the bed. Crying persisted for hours like a distant echo that would not let him rest. Finally sleep overcame him, but his mind was still trapped in the image of that woman in white. The next day at dawn Eduardo got up exhausted but determined not to be dominated by the legend. He went out to the town and looked for Don Carlos, who was waiting for him with a serious expression. "I told you it was not a story," said the old man, observing Eduardo's face. Eduardo looked at him, finally understanding the seriousness of the old man's words. The presence of La Llorona did not, it was just a legend. but an evil that stalked those who, for some reason, called it any more. Nothing would be the same for him. Years later, Eduardo could never get away from the echo of crying. Although he moved from Zinzuzan, something followed him. A feeling of emptiness that accompanied him every time he heard the wind between the trees or the water moving gently in the lagoon. He knew that the weeping woman would never let him go. It was a dark night, so dark that it seemed to swallow up all his passage. The fresh air brought with it the rustle of the trees that swayed softly as if trying to hide some secret. The stars timidly peeked through the sky, but the blanket of darkness seemed to be impenetrable. Esteban walked alone along the dirt path that crossed the field, surrounded by the altos bushes that covered the edge of the road. He had left late from the work, an exhausting day that seemed to never end, despite being used to the tranquility of rural nights. That time something in the air was strange, unsettling. The first drops of rain began to fall, announcing what seemed like a nearby storm. The sound of the wet earth under his boots echoed in his ears as his breathing became heavier, not from physical exertion, but from a growing sensation. Suddenly, a thin, hooded figure appeared before him just as the echo of his breathing joined the sound of the wind. Stephen stopped in dry. The figure stood a few meters away, motionless for a moment. Fear paralyzed him, and a shiver ran down his spine. The figure looked like a woman, but its posture was strange, as if it floated slightly above the ground. Stephen, he opened his mouth to ask who he was, but before he could say anything, a distant sound made him mute, a low but heartbreaking cry, like the lament of someone who had lost something irreplaceable. "Oh, my children!" The voice echoed in the darkness, and Esteban felt the cold penetrate to his bones. The woman who until then had remained motionless raised her head. Although her face was covered by the shadow of the hood, his eyes shone with a terrifying intensity. The crying continued, but now it seemed closer, more anguished. Esteban tried to back away, but his legs did not respond, as if the ground had become heavier, as if something invisible was holding him. "Who are you?" he managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. The figure, without moving a muscle, answered him with a broken voice, full of pain. "I am the mother who sought out his children in the darkness, but I no longer found them. Scares you of my crying, my pain?" Esteban tried to look away, but the figure seemed to approach as if the wind was dragging him towards him. The rain was already falling hard, soaking his clothes, but it didn't matter. The crying continued to resonate in the vast darkness, a melody of despair that plunged him into a kind of trance. Esteban felt the weight of the tragedy in his air, as if the earth itself had absorbed it. "The cry of a mother is never that," said the woman, her voice now almost an echo that seemed to come from everywhere. "I look for my children, and I find them in every corner, in every cry, in every sigh of the night." With each word the air became heavier. Esteban tried to take a step back, but his feet did not move. The crying, it became almost physical, as if sadness was stuck to his skin, as if the night itself was enveloping him. "Why are you doing?" he asked, feeling his voice break. The figure raised his hand, and the wind began to spin disorderly. "Because I am La Llorona, and my pain never ends. I lost my children, but now I look for others, because the suffering must be shared with someone else. You knew that there are souls that they do not rest, Esteban, lost souls like mine, who will never stop wandering." Esteban felt an inexplicable impulse to look at his feet. Something told him that he should not do it, but he could not help it. On the ground, through the undergrowth, he saw small traces of footprints, as if someone had walked before him. But the footprints did not disappear. They continued to follow an endless pattern. Before he could react, the figure took a step ahead, sliding across the ground with an unnatural agility. Esteban tried to scream, but his throat closed. The wind now blew with such force that it almost knocked him down. The woman's figure began to rise, as if her body were floating, and her eyes shone brightly. The woman's cry became a heartbreaking scream that seemed to cut through the air. Esteban covered his ears, but the sound went through his mind, filling her with pain. She felt her heart beat harder, as if it were going to explode, as if it were trapped in a nightmare with no way out. "I don't want to be alone," screamed the figure, now closer than ever. "I don't want to be alone. Oh, my children." Suddenly the crying stopped. The figure was silent again. Esteban, trembling, looked at her in fear, not knowing what to expect, but before she could react, the figure disappeared, as if vanishing into the fog. The wind stopped blowing, and the storm also dissipated, as if it had never existed. Esteban looked around without understanding what had just happened. Everything seemed to have returned to calm. But something continued to persist in the air, like a presence that did not go away. That night Esteban returned to his house with his body soaked and his soul broken. He tried to convince himself that what had happened to him lived was only a nightmare, a bad dream product of tiredness and exhaustion. But the footprints on the ground, the floating figure, the crying, everything was still present in her mind. She never walked that path again. No human being should walk alone in the dark thinking that she is safe, because in every corner, in every shadow you can be La Llorona, looking for someone else to share her suffering. The sun is already had put in the small town of Santa Teresa, located on the banks of the Tlapacoya River, a place where time seemed to have stopped and where legends were woven in whispers for generations. The inhabitants of the place lived with the constant presence of a terrifying legend, La Llorona. Many believed that her cry still resounded through the loneliest corners of the town, waiting to take away those who did not heed the warnings. Jose, a 24-year-old young man, had never believed in such stories. Born and raised in Santa Teresa, he thought that the stories of La Llorona were simple stories to scare children. But one afternoon, while he was walking in the countryside with his dog Max, something would change his perception forever. It had rained all day and the sky was covered by gray clouds that were reflected in the waters of the river. Jose decided to take a drink. The path that skirted the bank to reach the old bridge that crossed the river was not a place to frequent much, but that afternoon he had felt a strange need to walk alone, as if something was called to him. While he was walking, he noticed that Max was restless. The normally calm and playful dog began to bark incessantly, looking at the other side of the river where the trees formed a thick curtain of shadows. Jose, somewhat annoyed by his pet's attitude, he tried to calm him down, but something in the scene made him stop in the distance among the shadows of the trees. He could see a figure, Nina dressed in white, standing motionless, with her head tilted down. At first she thought it was one of the women of the village, perhaps collecting firewood or water from the river. However, the air became colder and heavy, and crying a low cry began to reach his ears, but full of desperation. It was a sound so painful that it made the hair on the back of his neck boil. Max began to growl, staring at the place where the figure was that was not yet moving. Jose decided to approach, driven by curiosity, but something inside him told him that he should retreat. However, the crying continued, and although an inexplicable fear made him advanced with each step. The crying became louder, more heartbreaking. Finally, when he was close enough to the figure, the head, the woman's face was covered by a layer of black and dirty hair. But what horrified him most was the empty and lost look that my children had. The woman screamed, her voice broken and full of pain. Jose took a step back, but something stopped him. The woman began to walk slowly towards him. His steps were soft, but they resounded in his mind like drums. The dog now silently seemed paralyzed with fear. The figure stopped a few meters away from him and raised a hand pointing towards the river. "My children, I lost them in this river," he whispered in a voice so faint that it could hardly be heard, "and now I must take everyone who approaches." Jose tried to speak, but the atmosphere became thick and his throat closed. He felt a weight on his chest, as if the earth itself was pressing on him. Before he could react, the figure disappeared, fading away as if he had never been there. Terrified, Jose ran back to the village, not daring to look back. When he reached his house, he locked the door and threw himself on his bed. But the crying continued to reverberate in his head. Tried to sleep, but the echoes of the woman's words echoed in his mind. "I must take everyone who approaches," he repeated over and over again. That night Jose could not fall asleep. The crying seemed to come from everywhere. He went out to the yard looking for something that could calm his mind. But the only thing he saw was the figure of a small, wet and dirty child standing on the threshold of the door. The child stared at him, and in his eyes Jose saw a reflection of what the woman had said. "My children," murmured the boy. The river. Jose tried to approach, but the child disappeared in the blink of an eye. A low scream was heard in the distance, and then Jose understood that deep down in his being the stories of La Llorona, they were never simple legends. The woman he had seen that afternoon was real, and her pain was eternal. The crying continued for several days, closer and closer to her home, as if La Llorona was waiting for her forgiveness, or perhaps her condemnation. Jose tried to ignore it, but in the end, one night, he decided to face the inevitable. He walked again to the river in the hope of giving something back to the woman who had suffered so much. When he reached the river, he found a small object floating in the water, a rag doll that had gotten wet with the recent rains. With trembling hands he lifted it and stood in front of him. "Here are your children," he said in a low voice, "but I can't take it anymore." Suddenly the crying stopped. The atmosphere before charged was relieved. Jose felt a strange peace when he looked at the river. The figure of the woman no longer it was there. Silence returned to Santa Teresa. But in Jose's heart the story of La Llorona never faded. He knew that sooner or later she would return to reclaim what was hers. It was a cold winter night in the small town of San Juan de los Huertas, a secluded place among the mountains and known for its ancient traditions. The icy air cut the skin, and the silence seemed to shroud in a cloak of mystery. Everything seemed to be calm, but deep down the murmur of the wind was the harbinger of something dark, something that the people knew very well, although they avoided talking about it. My name is Alvaro, and although I have always been skeptical of legends and myths, my life changed forever that night when a story I had heard since I was a child became more real than it had been. Imagine the story of La Llorona was not only a legend of the old, but it became my most terrible nightmare. San Juan de los Huertas was not the kind of place where great events were expected. People lived quietly, without haste, between the sound of the bells and the constant murmur of the birds that flew over the fields. However, everyone knew that on certain nights something sinister ran through the paths that bordered the river that crossed the village. The oldest always said the same thing: when the wind sounds strong on moonless nights, listen. Well, maybe you hear the crying. I used to laugh at such comments. I thought the old stories were just tales to scare the children. However, deep down in my being something told me that they must have something. It was really impossible to ignore the fear in people's eyes when they mentioned the woman dressed in white. One night, after a long day's work, I stayed in the village to rest. I decided to walk through the narrow cobbled streets, away from the hustle and bustle, and looking for some peace. I had heard about an old bridge over the river, a place I had never crossed, but that had always intrigued me. I knew that the legend spoke of La Llorona near that bridge, but not I paid much attention to them. Maybe a little adventure wouldn't hurt me. As I walked, the shadows lengthened and the silence was absolute. There was not a single sound except the whisper of the wind that seemed to carry with it distant whispers. The sky was covered by thick clouds and the moon was hidden, making the darkness even more imposing. Suddenly a strange sensation ran through my body. Was as if someone was watching me. But when I looked back I couldn't see anything. With my heart racing, I took a breath and continued on my way. When I reached the bridge something changed. The feeling of being observed increased. I stopped in front of the water that reflected a distorted image of the hidden stars. It was then that I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind, but it was not the cry of a woman. Deep lament, full of pain. I thought it could be someone from the village, maybe a mother looking for her child. But something in that cry was different. It was not a cry of despair, but a cry of eternal suffering, as if the woman's soul was trapped between two worlds. I decided to approach the sound, moved by a curiosity that I could no longer control. As I entered the darkness of the bridge, the crying intensified. It was, of course, it came from beyond the river. My breath was agitated, but something was pushing me to keep going. As if an invisible force was guiding me to that place. Crossing the bridge, I saw a figure in the background near the murky waters. A woman dressed in white with messy hair standing by the river. Her back was hunched over as if she were looking for something in the black waters. The scene, it was overwhelming. A cold sweat ran down my forehead. "Mother!" screamed the woman, her voice tearing through the night. Her lament was so deep, so desperate, that I felt my whole being freeze. My mind began to work at full speed. It was impossible. I knew what La Llorona meant, the legend that everyone had on the nights of wind. The woman who had lost her children and who, condemned by her own pain, wandered through the earth in search of them without finding peace. I froze, unable to move. The woman began to slowly turn, her face covered by messy hair. When her eyes met mine, the world seemed to stop. Her empty eyes, full of despair, did not reflect any human emotion. There was only emptiness and suffering. "Why are you looking at me?" Her voice broken by pain. Before she could answer, the figure began to vanish as if she were a shadow escaping the light. A deafening scream pierced the air and the woman disappeared completely. The wind calmed down and the darkness seemed to swallow everything around her. I fell to my knees terrified. La Llorona's cry kept echoing in my mind, although I could no longer hear her. Terror enveloped me, but a part of me knew that somehow I had witnessed something real. The legend had come to life. The next morning, I woke up in my bed, sweating with my heart racing. I wasn't sure if what I had experienced had been a dream or a nightmare, but I knew that something in me had changed. The people of the village didn't talk about what had happened, but I couldn't forget what I had seen since then. The distant cries on windy nights no longer seemed lonely to me, an echo of the past. Every time the wind blows strongly, I listen and, although I have never seen La Llorona again, I know that she is still there in some dark corner, waiting, wandering among the world of the living and the dead, in search of what she lost and that she will never be able to recover. Thank you for joining me on this tour full of stories. If you liked it, leave your like and subscribe. Not to miss more stories horror, and remember, in the description you will find links to everything you need, our official store, the Members Club for early access and exclusive content, and much more. I am the storyteller, and we will see each other very soon in the shadows. For years I worked for my aunt in a flower shop in front of a funeral home in the 80s. I worked at dawn selling flower arrangements to people who arrived late and sad to wake up to their dead, sometimes with tears in their eyes and other times almost forced, as if they were visiting someone they didn't care so much about. During the time I worked there I saw many things, some stranger than others, but what happened on a stormy night, exactly like this one today, while I recount, was very marked in my memory. It is a memory that I know I will carry with me to the grave. That night we were my companion Magda, and I liked it when I didn't have to be alone. We kept each other company and watched the early morning go by. Together, it rained so much so that we could barely see the funeral home in front of us, which seemed to be completely dark, as if there was no wake. That night is going to be a slow night, Magda said. There is no movement at all. We had other funeral homes nearby, but in that weather it seemed strange that someone would appear. We closed the door when the wind began to blow in, pushing the rain into the store. We started talking at the counter while I worked on some arrangements. Something in that activity of cutting stems and flowers, making the arrangements, calmed me down. I entered Magda's conversation while she cut and cut without thinking automatically. She told me how terrified nights like that terrified her. Remembering when she was a child and had to be alone with her younger siblings. She was 12 years old, but she was the oldest and she had to take care of them while her father worked. She told me that they always warned her that hidden between the rain and the night there were dangers that they took advantage of to approach where they normally couldn't. Someone knocked on the door and took us out of the stories. Suddenly she was a lady in black with a veil that barely showed her face. It was not uncommon for some people to still dress like that, with customs from other places. I opened the door for her and placed a mat so that she could dry when I entered. When I opened, together with the lady, a cold came in that froze us to the bone. The soaked lady stood without saying anything. We asked her how we could help her, but without answering she went to one of the most beautiful arrangements. Magda and I stayed watching her. We learned that moments like that there are people who do not they like to have a salesman follow them around the store. They prefer to choose calmly the arrangement that others are going to take. However, they need us to practically put something in their hands, anything. That lady, from what I perceived at a glance, seemed to be the type who did not want to talk. The rain was increasing, but we saw a car pass slowly, which stopped in front of the funeral home. It seemed that there would be movement after all. Magda walked to the entrance to get a better look. A lightning bolt that fell very close to us illuminated for a moment the people inside the car. They were both wearing hats. Despite the rain, we noticed that the car was very old. I had never seen one like this. "Sorry, madam, you have some service at the funeral home in front of me?" I asked as I continued with my eyes fixed on the car. I wanted to ask if there was something special happening that night, investigate subtly, but she didn't answer Magda, and I turned almost at the same time to the lady, but she was no longer there. When we saw that the store was empty, we heard movement in the back in the little room that we used as a deposit despite having to go to check why the lady had gone there. Neither Magda nor I dared to take a step. The deposit was completely dark. We didn't know if she was waiting for us, if she was dangerous. MDA suddenly plucked up the courage and without thinking screamed out loud that she couldn't be there, that she was looking for trouble. She came in quickly, turning on the light, and I was waiting outside, unable to move, without seeing what was happening in there. "They see me." I heard her voice calling me. I went in with her, but there was no one there. That little room had no way out. There was no way to that. The lady had left at that moment. We realized that the lady had come in very wet, but there was not a single drop of water on the ground. We got out of there and looked across the street in the increasingly heavy rain, and the car was no longer there, but there were 3 figures standing on the sidewalk in front, apparently watching us. Were 2 tall men with a hat, and in the middle of them a woman with a veil. I can swear that it was the same woman who was with us moments ago. Suddenly they crossed the street in our direction. Magda ran to the door, put the sign closed, and I only managed to lower the curtains and turn off the light. The 3 people positioned themselves in front of the door, barely noticeable behind the curtains outside. It was also dark. I called the owner of the flower shop, my aunt. I didn't mind waking her up in the middle of the night. It was an emergency and she had told us to call at any time if something happened, but she didn't seem to understand what was going on, even when Magda explained clearly. I just heard my aunt ask on the other end of the line, and the lady in black was still in there, and Magda said no, but that we had not seen her leave either. My aunt told us to wait a moment, that she would communicate with a police friend who was in the downtown area and that he would come there. She told us that we hid in the warehouse and closed the door tightly. They knocked on the door. One of the three figures knocked on the door. Magda and I hid and heard how they tried to open it. We ran to the back of the warehouse, and a moment later we heard that typical sound of older patrol cars, like when they give a warning on the street. We went back to the front of the store. People were no longer there. Through the curtains we saw the light of the police approaching. It stopped right in front of us, and we approached the door. A policeman in his 50s got out, accompanied by a very young one. We opened the door, and they asked us if everything was okay. Good, how are you? They asked us to take a look, but the truth is that I did not understand well what they said happened. We tried to make a small summary of what had happened to us, even with a little embarrassment, because it seemed like a simple story of children. The two policemen looked at each other, and then the oldest spoke to us. Look, if you can go to rest. There will be no work today. The funeral homes nearby are not working, and the night is very strange. We came to answer a call from the cleaning lady of the funeral home on the back street. She said she heard someone walking in an empty room where there was only one deceased who no one had gone to visit. Tell about the woman in black. Chief, interrupted the young policeman. Yes. Some colleagues received a report from a woman who she jumped off a bridge nearby dressed all in black. Several people who were sheltering from the rain saw her, but there were no traces of her under the bridge. Nothing to indicate that something like this really happened, that someone had jumped the night. It is very strange. As soon as the policeman left, Magda called her father, who arrived about 30 minutes later to pick us up. She gave me a ride to a taxi point that were going to my house, but since there wasn't none took me there. It was strange. The city seemed empty. It's strange to see so few people around. Here, the few people who were on the street seemed strange, almost shadows in the distance, in dark places. It was like we were walking in a ghost city. Over time we tried to find explanations, but we never found them. Magda and I always kept that as the memory of a strange night where something very strange happened. Sometimes I want to convince myself that it was just mass hysteria, everyone thinking that something terrible was about to happen. Feeling like this can make you imagine things. No. Now I'm one of those people who, despite having seen something, prefers to say that they don't believe. I convince myself that I didn't see anything until stormy nights come back like that, until it rains just like today, and I remember what comes with storms, and fear becomes real again. If you like this story, leave your like, and don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell to not miss our daily videos. Join the members club and enjoy ad access to videos and other exclusive benefits. Click on the Join button below the video. In a quiet community in Santiago de la Sierra, a picturesque town nestled between mountains in northern Mexico. Born on November 12, 1991, a young man named Mateo Sandoval came from a middle-class family known in the town for its good manners and active participation in community events. Mateo was a reserved but brilliant boy whose fascination with science led him to excel in the local high school. When he turned 18, Mateo received a scholarship to study geology at a prestigious university in Monterrey, where his professors and peers were impressed by his dedication and charisma, his academic achievements. It didn't take long for them to take him to advanced programs, where he completed a master's degree and a doctorate in seismic studies for the outside world. Mateo was the perfect example of perseverance and success, a rising star in his field. However, what no one knew was that Mateo was hiding a dark and disturbing secret, something that slowly began to emerge during the course of the year. His university years. In his second year in Monterrey, Mateo decided to share a house with other students to save expenses. It was a spacious and old house with high ceilings and separate rooms that housed 5 tenants, men and women. One of his housemates, Anna, would remember years later her initial impression of Mateo always made everyone laugh. His humor was strange, but no one considered him offensive. One night while they were having dinner together, Mateo made a comment that Anna would never forget. He joked about installing a hidden camera in the bathroom to record comical moments. The others took it as an absurd occurrence, but Anna remembered that his smile was not that of someone who was simply playing. Although he did not give it more importance at that moment, something in her felt uneasy. What none of the tenants knew was that Mateo had already installed one camera in the shared bathroom. Every time someone used the place, He watched from his laptop in the privacy of his room. Over time, this behavior became more sinister. Technology and access to the internet offered Matteo a new world of possibilities. It was in 2012 when he discovered a dark side of the network, a place where anonymity was the rule and social norms disappeared. Fascinated, Matteo began to frequenting forums on the deep web using a software called Lightning that allowed him to browse without leaving a trace. At first, his curiosity was limited to exploring. However, he soon fell into the most macabre corners. In those sites, not only graphic videos were shared, but also methods to manipulate and exploit others. Matteo, with his brilliant intellect and his calculating personality, did not take long to adopt these practices, using them to extend his control over those who surrounded him. In 2014, Matteo took his obsession a step further. While exploring anonymous forums, he stumbled upon publications that described psychological manipulation techniques. It was in those spaces where he began to create false identities. His first attempt was simple. He pretended to be a young photography enthusiast who was looking for models for artistic projects. Under this disguise, he managed to convince several people, mainly young women, to send him personal photographs. Initially harmless, when he received the images, Matteo began his game. Slowly revealed his true identity, making it clear that he no longer had to keep the promise of an artistic project. Instead, the photos became tools of blackmail. He threatened to share them, and his victims did not follow his every command. It was in that same year when he contacted a teenager from a small town in Durango under the pseudonym of Sofia. The young woman, looking for opportunities to earn some money and help his family. Matteo, seeing being an art student of the same age, started a conversation, apparently friendly. Little by little he gained her trust until he convinced her to send him photographs under the excuse of a human portrait project. When he had enough material, Matteo changed the tone of his messages. He confessed that he was not who he said yes, and that if he did not obey his demands, the images would be sent to her family and friends. The young woman, terrified and feeling completely trapped, gave herself to her demands. Among the first orders that Matteo gave her, there was a particularly humiliating and degrading one that forced her to perform it in a public place. The crying girl complied. From that moment on, Matteo's demands, they became more and more twisted. Daily, the young woman received messages with new tasks. Matteo seemed to enjoy the control he exercised over her, recounting his experience in dark forums where other users they commented on her ability to manipulate her victims. Her goal was not just to obtain material. She wanted to break the young woman completely, to reduce her to a state of despair from which she could not escape. The teenager tried on several occasions to end the harassment, begged Matteo to leave her alone, promising that he would not tell anyone. However, this only goaded him more. On one occasion, when the young woman suggested that she couldn't continue, he sent her screenshots showing that she had already shared some of the photos on internet forums. He also warned her that if she tried to ask for help, he would make sure the images reached her family directly. The girl's life began to fall apart. Her grades dropped, she distanced herself from her friends and stopped talking to her family. Every message that came in was a threat looming over her family. She as an inescapable shadow. Meanwhile, Matteo continued his daily routine as a researcher at the university, projecting the image of a charismatic and impeccable young man for years. This double life allowed him to continue with his crimes without raising suspicion. But what Matteo did not know was that his obsession with documenting every detail of his abuses would eventually be his undoing. While Matteo continued to perfect his sinister network of manipulation, began to increase in complexity of his activities. Using various false identities, not only sought out new victims, but also infiltrated digital communities that shared twisted interests similar to his own. In these, Matteo, he was not a simple observer. He became an active participant, exchanging advice, sharing methods, and boasting about his achievements with other anonymous users. It was in these forums that Matteo created a kind of manual. This document compiled in detail the tactics that used to identify and manipulate his victims, described how to gain their trust, how to keep them trapped through blackmail, and how to hide digital traces that could lead to their identification. Although it was never discovered how many users accessed this manual, subsequent research would reveal that its content had a devastating impact, inspiring others to replicate his methods. At some point between 2015 and 2016, Matteo expanded his activities by contacting people from different ages and nationalities. Would later discover that he used around 30 different identities to get closer to his victims. Each identity was meticulously crafted with stories and details that made them difficult to question. Some of their identities were friendly young men, while others pretended to be authority figures to intimidate and manipulate. Among the victims who most shocked the investigators was a young woman who had just graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. University that had published an art portfolio online. Matthew, posing as a curator of a prestigious gallery, contacted her and offered her the opportunity to exhibit her work at a fictitious event. Through weeks of email exchange, she managed to get her to send him personal material, including photographs. When she finally revealed her true intentions, the woman remained Ada, despite being older and more experienced, also fell into her feeling that he had no way to escape in the background of these activities. Matteo continued with his life apparently normal. He published academic research, attended conferences, and participated in university projects. Those who knew him described him as brilliant and friendly, unable to imagine that behind that was hidden a methodical and unscrupulous manipulator. However, mistakes began to accumulate. One of his victims, tired of the constant threats, decided seeking help. Although at first he had no one to believe him, he contacted an organization dedicated to the protection of vulnerable people on the internet. This was the first step that triggered a broader investigation. Through cooperation between international agencies and cybersecurity experts, patterns were identified in Matteo's activities. Investigators tracked communications and digital connections that linked the multiple identities used, began to put the puzzle together, revealing the scale of the crimes committed by Matteo and the network of abuse that had built. The fence closed around Matteo over several months. The authorities, after analyzing the digital traces he had left, managed to identify the locations from which he operated, although he had taken numerous precautions to remain anonymous. Small inconsistencies in his digital movements allowed the experts to, in cybersecurity, tracking his activity. It was at the end of 2017 when undercover agents managed to infiltrate one of the forums that Matteo frequented using fake identities. They posed as users interested in his methods. This allowed them to collect crucial evidence, including direct communications in which Matteo boasted of his achievements. The international operation involved multiple agencies, all collaborating to make sure that he could not escape. On the day of his arrest, Matteo was in his office at the university working on a project seemingly harmless. The police arrived unannounced, confiscating computers, storage devices, and documents. The public face of the brilliant researcher crumbled in seconds when the authorities read the charges against him. The case shocked not only the university but also the entire academic and scientific community. No one could believe that someone with such an impeccable history was behind such heinous crimes. Yet the evidence was irrefutable. On the confiscated devices, hundreds of incriminating files were found, including detailed records of his interactions with victims during the trial. Matthew remained cold and aloof, showing little to no remorse for the lives he had destroyed. The victims' testimonies were heartbreaking, revealing the extent of his cruelty and the psychological aftermath his actions left behind. Despite his defiant attitude, the evidence accumulated was too strong to allow any defense. The sentence was exemplary. Matteo was sentenced to spend several decades in prison without the possibility of early release. The judge described him as someone with methodical and cruel behavior whose only intention was to inflict suffering on his victims. In addition, the removal of all materials related to his crimes and the implementation of measures to protect his victims, Matteo's case left a deep mark on the way internet safety and online abuse prevention were approached. For many, it became a grim reminder of how digital tools, when they're bad, can be a devastating weapon in the wrong hands. I used to work the night shift at a medium-sized hotel that belongs to a chain, and they're located in the suburbs. It was one of those places where everything is a little too clean and where silence seems to be the only permanent guest. You might know the guy, located off a main road far enough out of town to tie down those who didn't want to pay the high prices. Downtown was the kind of place where seemingly nothing ever happens until something happens, and guess what? Who always has a front row seat when that happens? The unfortunate employee who was on duty that night. Being completely honest, the work was not bad, but it was not the best either. Most nights were extremely quiet, just me, a cup of coffee that cooled slowly, and a flashing monitor that showed some empty aisles. From time to time a guest was late, or I had to deal with some absent-minded, but overall, it was a monotonous job. The hardest thing was definitely staying awake, especially after midnight, when time seemed to stretch out infinitely between the paperwork I had to fill out and the administrative maintenance in the back. Always there was something to do to get the hours through. I had already been working there for almost 2 years and had seen my level of strange people, There was always the guy who parked near the dumpster, and he would stay there long enough for him to ask you if he lived in his car or if he was just coming because our parking lot was dark enough to do things you'd rather not know. Sometimes some addict would manage to scrape together a room for a night but refuse to leave the next day. Domestic disputes were also common, upset voices, doors slamming shut, and the unpleasant task of calling the police while trying not to think about what was really going on behind those locked doors. But most of those things were manageable, part of the job. You deal with them, take notes, and move on. As my father said, don't take it to heart, and just let it go. And then the night came when I met the man who specifically asked for room 401A. It was a Wednesday at the night in the middle of the week, and things were slower than usual. I had started my shift. It was 11 p.m., and I knew I was staying until 7 a.m. The lobby was quiet. The only sounds were the soft hum of the air conditioner and the steady drip of the coffee maker filling up for the third time that night. I would say around midnight the front door opened and man walked in. At first glance, there was nothing particularly noticeable about him. He had the typical look of a business traveler in his 30s, shaved in a dark coat and button-down shirt. He looked a little tired, but nothing out of the ordinary. He approached the counter. His steps were light and his expression calm. Nothing to raise my alarms. "Good night, sir," I said, breaking the silence. "You need a room for tonight?" The man nodded, his eyes sweeping the hall as if looking for something or someone. "Yes." He replied with a calm voice, "I need a room, but not just any room. I want one in particular." I raised an eyebrow, curious. Most people just wanted any room available. I had never seen anyone ask for one in specific. "It's okay. Which room?" I asked, trying to look professional. "The 401A," said casually. I froze for a second, processing what I had just asked for. The problem was that we didn't have any rooms with letters. All our rooms were numbered by floor and unit number. On the first floor, rooms ranged from 101 to 113. On the second floor, from 214 to 227, and so on. Room 401 didn't exist. I thought maybe I had misunderstood, so I asked him to repeat the 401A. He said again, and this time he looked me straight in the eye with a sly smile on his face. I let out a laugh, thinking he was doing some kind of joke. "I'm afraid you've got confused. Sir, we don't have a room 401. Maybe he meant the 401. Man's expression didn't change. If anything, it seemed more funny, as if I was the one making a mistake. "I'm not sure. It's the 401. He replied in a firm voice, trying to find a way to explain to him. "Sir, there is no room 401 in this hotel. We don't have rooms with letters. I can offer you one on the 4th floor if that's what you're looking for." But his demeanor changed instantly. His calm, serene energy was replaced by something much darker and more threatening. He took a step closer to the counter with his eyes narrowed. "I asked for room 401. You're telling me you don't have it?" I took an involuntary step back. My heart started beating quickly. This wasn't just a guy who had confused. His place was serious, very serious, and his frustration seemed to increase with every second. Suddenly I realized that he could be armed. I tried to keep my composure, even though my mind was already running 1,000 miles an hour, looking for a way to handle the situation. "Look, sir," I said, trying to get my voice to not tremble, "I don't know what to tell you. We don't have a room 401. It literally doesn't exist in our system. Maybe you got confused about the hotel, or maybe there was some kind of mistake. I can offer you another room without a problem. How about the 440 is available and is on the 4th floor?" The man's eyes were fixed on mine, cold and calculating. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me as if he was memorizing every detail of my face. Then he slowly leaned over the counter and lowered his voice to a threatening whisper. "You're lying," he muttered. "I know that room is available, and I'll hide you." Before I could answer, he straightened up, adjusted his coat, and walked out of the hall without saying another word. The automatic doors closed behind him, leaving me shaking and confused. I spent the rest of my shift on alert, jumping with every little noise I heard. I couldn't help thinking that at any moment I would come back, maybe screaming or worse. But no. That night passed without further incident, and when my shift was over I almost convinced myself that it had all been a strange misunderstanding. Maybe the guy was just crazy, or maybe he had tried to make a joke on me that I didn't understand. But if the story ended there, it wouldn't be so memorable, right? Because it didn't end there. Exactly a week later, the memory of that strange encounter, like Paba, to fade away slowly. Of course, I remained alert during my shifts, half hoping that this man would reappear, some stranger than others, but no one came looking for a room that didn't exist. When he arrived the next Wednesday, I had almost forgotten everything. People like him from time to time had already had my of eccentric customers over the years, paranoid guests who thought the government was spying on them, couples who got into fights and they were trying to drag me into their drama. That guy was no different, just one more lunatic who probably mistook our hotel for another. That night I arrived for my shift at the usual time, 11 o'clock. My coworker Jorge was finishing his shift. He seemed to have had a long day and gave me a quick greeting as I walked in, grabbing his jacket from the back of the chair. "Smooth turn and no incidents, more or less," said Jorge, stretching with a yawn. "But a weird guy showed up before, left a room card." I puckered, the gentleman intrigued. "A room card?" "Yes," Jorge replied. "It wasn't from this hotel, but he thought we wanted it back. The strange thing is that it's one of ours. Only old, it looked like he'd been through hell. Now he caught my interest. We had changed our cards. I had been in the room a couple of years ago, but I'm sure some of the old ones would still be around. It wasn't uncommon for people to take the cards after checking out, but most of the time they were useless once deactivated." I walked to the counter and Jorge handed me the card. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the number printed on it. 401. To my jaw, it fell. I must have been looking at that card for at least a minute, with my mind racing to try to understand what I was seeing. "You're sure what's ours?" I asked, my voice a little louder than I intended. Jorge shrugged. "It looks like one of the old. You've been here longer than I should know better." The plastic was worn and scratched like it had been used for years and years, but there it was, clear since day 401. It didn't make sense. I knew there was no such room and Jorge knew it too, but there was that room card staring at me like it was a macabre joke. "I'm going to take a look at it," you mutter. Jorge didn't seem too worried, gave me a quick greeting, and left, probably anxious to go home and forget about the strange situation of his shift. As soon as he left, I sat down on my chair behind the counter, still holding the room card in my hand. My fingers brushed against the numbers as if touching them somehow changed what was in that there. They didn't suddenly feel a deep need to test that card on all the doors of the building just to see which of them would be the famous 401A. I looked at the clock, 11:30 at night. The night, it stretched out before me for the first time in a long time. I wasn't sure I wanted to be there. I spent the next hour fidgeting, changing the channel on the TV behind my desk, trying to distract myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every creak of the building, every little noise in the hallway, made me nervous. I kept checking the security cameras, half-jokingly hoping to see that man who asked for room 401A watching me from one of those empty corridors, but the corridors were still deserted. There were no guests or staff, just the empty image of the fourth floor on one of the screens. It was then that I heard it at first. It was just a slight knock, weak and irregular, as if someone was knocking softly on a door in the distance. I ignored it, thinking that it was probably the sound of the ice machine or some guest closing the door too loudly. But the sound didn't stop. Instead, it got louder and more insistent, as if it was getting closer. I was in my seat, paying more attention. The tapping was coming from somewhere behind me, behind the wall. But that didn't make sense. My office was in the back of the hotel, away from the rooms, and there was no reason whatsoever for anyone to be knocking behind that wall. I got up quickly with my heart racing and walked to the corner of the office where the sound was loudest. The tapping was slow, methodical, almost as if someone was sending a message through the wall. Pressing my ear against the wall, trying to figure out what could be causing that noise, and then the tapping stopped. I stood, motionless, holding my breath as the seconds lengthened in front of me. The silence became unbearable. The phone rang. I jumped in fright, almost throwing the chair as I ran to answer reception. I said with a slightly trembling voice. For a moment there was nothing, just silence on the line, and then a breath, a slow and deliberate breath, as if someone was standing very close to the phone listening. "Hello?" I asked again, trying to sound firm. "There is someone there." The same breathing continued for a few more seconds, and then the line that went silent. I quickly hung up the phone with my heart beating frantically and checked the caller ID on the screen. There was no number, just a sequence of zeros, the type of call that usually appears when someone calls from inside the hotel. I looked at the phone, hoping it would ring again, but the room was completely silent, too unsettling. The knocking had stopped, and now the breathing too much. I had disappeared. I looked at the security cameras again. Nothing yet. The fourth floor was still empty. The corridors were still and motionless. I tried to convince myself that everything was okay. "It's just a joke," I told myself. "Some guest is playing with you. Or maybe the man from last week is planning an elaborate prank to scare you." But there was something in the back of my stomach that told me this was different. It wasn't a drunk guest. It wasn't a faulty phone line. Something wasn't right. I spent the next few hours on full alert, checking security footage every few seconds, walking around the office listening to any other strange sound. From time to time I thought I heard distant noises somewhere far away, the sound of a door closing. But I never saw anyone on the monitors. Then around 3 a.m. the phone rang again. I picked it up cautiously, expecting to hear the same breath, and there was the same breath, heavy and deliberate, but this time there was something else. A voice, almost a whisper, but clear enough for me to hear. "Room 401 is waiting for you," the voice said, and then the line was mute again. I stood there with the receiver still in my hand, my mind racing at full speed. The voice on the phone had been so calm, so direct, but it wasn't the words that made me uncomfortable, it was the tone. It sounded like someone who knew something that I didn't, like I was aware of a secret I was about to find out about, whether I liked it or not. It was enough for me to quiet the main office, and I waited for the dawn. No one came in, and I made no effort to do anything else. When the sun came up, I left a note with my resignation and left. As soon as my replacement arrived, no job in the world was worth that kind of heartbreak. I never saw that man again or received any more strange calls. But for one night I would have sworn that I believed in ghosts. Months later, when I told the story to some friends, they had a theory that seemed to make sense. They thought that maybe room 401A wasn't really a room, but some kind of code for something. Maybe that man wasn't looking for a room, but something else. Anyway, I don't want to know what. It was one of my earliest memories, as being on the playground of a new school trying to make friends. This was in the 3rd year, then at elementary school age. For Mexicans who read this, I met a group of boys playing soccer. I asked one of them if I could join, and he said yes, but only yes. I passed him the ball. It seemed like a fair deal, so I agreed. The next day I asked the same guy if I could sit with him at lunchtime, and he said yes, but only if I gave him my dessert. Although it seemed fair, I accepted anyway, and then we ate in silence. I didn't touch my dessert, assuming that boy would have it when he was ready. But when he finished his dessert, I offered him the mine, and suddenly changed his mind, shook his head, and pushed a small cup towards me. We have been friends ever since. Eduardo, as I called him by his middle name, was my best friend throughout elementary school, and we ended up in the same high school. I also had my first soda with him. Our first girlfriends were best friends. And he was present at almost every significant event of my adolescence in AU. We eventually broke up, going to different colleges, but we kept in touch, and he ended up coming back here for work once he graduated. He was there for me in all my breakups. He helped me move into my first apartment for real, and I was the best man at his wedding, and the list goes on. I was there for all the ups and downs of him and Laura, buying a house, having a baby, and all those other adult stuff. I was the first person I called about the accident. There was always something quite comforting about our excursions. If you're running out of food and water, exposed to the elements, there's no time to worry about the problems you have in the real world. I didn't know to what extent this would extend to devastating grief, but in the short term it seemed to work, as Eduardo seemed much more lively. Having something what to focus on was ordering camping gear online, testing in his mother's garden, and with all the plan we had to do. He was also a lot more talkative. It was like the old days in many ways, but with one noticeable difference besides the obvious things. Eduardo had suggested a place to visit. Anyone reading this could say yes, and that he had never taken any of the decisions when it came to our hiking excursions. After taking the initiative in planning the first ones, he left everything up to me so he could focus on the equipment and get us there. Then when he told me he wanted to visit Itai National Park, in particular a place called Black Eagle Peak, it was a refreshing change, if I'm honest. We had never been to Itza before, so I was very anxious to go, but Eduardo's bland plan included lots of freshwater rivers, hikes in hills, and a great breakfast, at last, which sounded absolutely great. The longest time we had been hiking was a week, and since we were just starting over, I wasn't surprised when he said he only wanted to go for 2 days. I was excited that he seemed to be getting back to being the same, but if I had known, I think I would never have gone with him. Everything seemed fine on the trip up to Itza. It was actually like in the old days, taking turns. Music, unexpectedly good weather for April, which put us in a good mood for an epic hike. Considering it was his first time, Eduardo did a great job planning the route and took us through amazing landscapes. We rode about 8 or 9 kilometers, going down gently down a hill and then along a narrow river until you reach a small lake. It was in early April when he called me, or around 2 in the morning. I knew something was going on by the afternoon of the call, but I could never have guessed how terrible the news was. Laura was taking her daughter back from the playgroup when 2 thieves ran them over in a crosswalk, and his daughter was pronounced dead at the scene. while Laura passed away in a hospital fighting for her life in a matter of hours. Eduardo's entire world was ripped off by two monsters in a car. He was devastated as you can imagine. He took sick leave from work, was prescribed antidepressants, and then went to live with his parents because he could take care of himself. We all helped him by taking care of him, making sure he stayed away from alcohol and everything else, but that was pretty much all we could do, losing his wife and daughter in that way so suddenly. It's something you have to get over for yourself, you know, and for a long time Eduardo seemed paralyzed, and I honestly couldn't blame him. But one day I got a very amazing text message of the one that simply said, "You're ready to go for a ride." To explain, take a walk was what we called our hiking and camping excursions that we used to do when we were younger. I think we always imagined ourselves as explorers, but since we would never pass a doping test, we were content with these epic excursions through the countryside. Sometimes for a week, we camped in different places every night, and we would come home without bathing and smelling like campfire smoke while we were telling ghost stories around the fire at night. Was so much fun. We managed to do about 5 or 6 excursions, big and small, before jobs and girlfriends started to consume all our time. No matter how long we waited for the day we could go out again, I thought it might have been a little soon. After discussing it, we agreed to the second week of April, almost a year after the accident. I tried to tell myself that the timing was just a coincidence, but at the same time I completely understood if he wanted to get away from it all for a few days, especially around the end of the lake. About 50 met from the water's edge and set up our little am-shaped shelters looking at each other. Once we were ready, we made some tea on our gas stove and then went to collect firewood for the night. We were quiet while we worked, and I chalked that up to the fact that we were both focused on finding good branches. But then Eduardo didn't seem to cheer up again. I realized halfway through, on the way to preparing my dinner, that he wasn't going to join me. He said he wasn't hungry and would eat later when he felt like it, but he arrived later and he still didn't seem to feel like eating. We stayed up late and all we did was sit by the fire swapping stories, but I didn't see a morsel of food pass through his lips when I entered my shelter to sleep. Eduardo said he'd just stay up a little longer to look at the stars. That didn't raise any alarm for me. But what it did was when I woke up about 6 or 7 hours later and found him still sitting by the fire. I'm not talking about sitting by the fire making a cup of tea with his hair disheveled, and obviously having slept at least a few hours. I'm talking about the same position with the tent seemingly intact, as if I hadn't moved a muscle for hours and hours. The first words that came out of my mouth when I left my shelter were, "You didn't sleep." I didn't need to answer me. The big dark circles under his eyes said it all. Was then that I began to realize that accepting the camping excursion might not have. It was a good idea. I asked if everything was okay, and I really laughed a little when he said a little tired. I responded by asking if he was really okay before saying there was no shame in giving up and going home if he really didn't feel good. It was a total lie, but it worked. It was then that he partially told me what he had planned. There would be no walks on the rivers for a few days before a big breakfast at it. Saw he and I, using his words, needed to do something for Laura and the baby, and that something involved not eating or sleeping. It was okay to drink water, but only when he was really thirsty, and after abstaining from eating and sleeping for 3 days, he would go to the waterfall. Remember the waterfall I mentioned? The one we had seen from our camp? Well, Eduardo said there was a small crack in La Roca behind. It wasn't a big deal, just big enough for a person to sit without getting too wet. And when I asked him how he knew, he said he had checked it overnight. Everything was exactly as he said it would be. And when I asked him what Eduardo was, he said he was too tired to explain. The only reason he partially explained what he was doing was because he needed me there, and he thought if he didn't really tell me I could have left. He knew how he looked like a guy starving himself because he was tired of living or something. But he assured me that he didn't. He needed me to be there to help him get back to the car when he was done, because he would probably be too weak to do it. I just remember sitting by the fire for a minute or two, stunned, silent, trying to understand what Eduardo told me. I was saying, when I finally gathered my thoughts, I asked him why he needed to sit in that little crevice after 3 days without eating or sleeping. It would help him, of course. I just needed to know why. Again, he said something like, "It is because of the time and the baby," and if I'm honest, that was as good as an explanation I needed. I had no idea what I was trying to do, but I knew it would be difficult and probably dangerous also. But what else can you do when a friend asks you for something like that, saying they can't trust anyone else to do it? There was no way to get them out of there. Just leaving them was not an option, and as much as it seemed like the best option, calling emergency services seemed like a betrayal. Imagine someone placing all that trust in you and you You just refuse and get them arrested. I know that it's an emotional response and not a rational one, but at the time, it just didn't seem right. There didn't seem to be any other option besides doing what he asked. To make sure that whatever happened went well, on the other side, it turns out that the first day of his fast was really the day before we left. The second was the hike to the waterfall. Eduardo looked a little exhausted on the hike, but he attributed it at age and a bad night's sleep or something. Then that second day we were in Itza would be the third and final day without eating or sleeping, which meant that his entire plan would end in the wee hours of the morning. Those not like good news. When I heard it, but I was still worried to see him in such a bad state, and that only added more anxiety to the whole situation. When he thanked me for the last time, he turned around and disappeared into the water. Exactly 27 minutes passed when I thought I heard something about the noise of the waterfall. I remember abusing my ear thinking that my ears were playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again. It was barely audible about the noise of the waterfall, but it sounded a lot like a person, and then suddenly there it was, Eduardo. He was white like a paper, thin as a stick and shaking violently. Then there were the noises he was making, and God, they were inhuman. Not exactly crying, not exactly screaming, all muffled for 3 days with no food or sleep. As soon as he reached the banks of the creek, Bob just collapsed and I threw his backsplash on him. He couldn't speak, he could barely move, and I did my best to drag him back into the fire and leave him there to warm him properly. I asked him if he could eat and he nodded very weakly. So I put some cereal bars and a bottle of water in front of him. I had to feed him and hold the bottle to his lips so that he could drink properly. Eduardo ate slowly, with silent tears rolling down his cheeks, and I also spilled some once he had eaten some more and drank water. Eduardo me. He asked me to help him get into his tent so he could finally sleep. Let's make sure I couldn't do it. I was caught between being too tired to stay awake and too scared to sleep. It was the lack of sleep that really wore him down. I could see how his brain was deteriorating from being awake so long without fuel. When he went to the bathroom, his urine was brown, not that dark yellow unhealthy you see after on a summer night in a beer garden. It was a dense brown like rum or whiskey or something. I know it might seem a little strange to pay attention to his urine in that way, but things like that are pretty shocking when you've never seen them before. It wasn't just his body, it was his mind. He also started repeating things, mixing up the words, and then going back to an earlier point of a conversation, as if I'd lost the thread, and it hadn't been 10 or 20 minutes when the sun started to set. It was ready for it all to end. But we still had a lot ahead of us. Before that, I didn't sleep a second that night. I also wasn't completely convinced that Eduardo wouldn't try to hurt himself in some way. I just had to trust that he wouldn't be questioned on that night for months, and he had gone over it so many times that he was bored of thinking about it, much less talking about it. He told me he understood how much it should be annoying, but he would tell me everything when he was done. But until then he had to wait. Finally the time came. I took him to the waterfall and he started to undress. I think that was always a given. He didn't want to get his only jacket and pair of boots wet in the process, but it was cold terrible, and he was shaking like a dog when he handed me the last of his clothes. Over the noise of the waterfall, I heard him tell me that if he didn't come out within an hour I should go get him. He would be naked and wet in the middle of the freezing night in Ita, and he would be in danger of hypothermia. And he would be exposed for a long time. I feel I need to explain at this point that I am not a very spiritual person and I don't believe in paranormal or spiritual experiences. I think Eduardo, he pushed himself to his physical and psychological limits and induced a kind of trance or altered state of consciousness, and I think deep down he knows it too. The thing is that he doesn't care, and I don't really blame him either, and as much as I don't pretend to know how it worked, I understand why. He wanted to do it, have that opportunity to feel the presence or connection with a deceased loved one. Even if it's not real, I admit that I see the appeal. Anyone who has gone through something as tragic as losing their wife and daughter in an accident deserves some kind of comfort, even if it's self-induced, and if sitting behind a waterfall for 3 days gave Eduardo some peace of mind, who am I to judge him at the end of the day? Eduardo wasn't hurting him. No one but himself was just dealing with his own pain in the best way he knew how, and if that meant doing something as extreme as what he did, then so be it. Then there's the story of our trip to the Ita Mountains. It's not the typical camping and hiking adventure we expected, but it was an experience we'll never forget, and while Eduardo didn't tell me all the details of what happened behind that waterfall, I respect his privacy enough not to pressure him. Whatever he experienced there, we'll leave it between him and his deceased loved ones. The important thing is that in the end, Eduardo is much better, and that's all that really matters. But the more I fought against that, the easier it became. I don't know exactly what time it was at the time, but I remember seeing a little blue light on the distant horizon. I closed my eyes for a second, and then the next thing I knew, it was broad daylight. My eyes were burning, and I felt sick because of how exhausted I was. But when I saw that Eduardo was still there, breathing and sleeping, I knew everything would be fine. I tried to sleep a few more hours, but a brain fed by a nap made it impossible. I wanted to wake him up, make him eat some more and give him some coffee, but they were selfish reasons. What I really wanted to know was what had happened at the waterfall, for he had gone through that hell, but God knows he needed the break, and there would be plenty of time to ask questions on the way back. I think this piece is long enough to sum up that conversation as best he can. After taking Eduardo back to it safely, we bought more food. I bought Eduardo one of those big bottles of coconut water so he could continue to rehydrate on the trip, and then we started our journey back home. He didn't tell me much about what he had done or why he had done it. He said he was still processing them, but in short it was so. He read something online about that waterfall, something about how the ancient shamans used to go there to have spiritual experiences. The story said that if you were focused on meditating by someone with enough intensity, someone who had already passed away might feel their presence, receive their guidance or connection or something like that. The only rule was that you had to sit there for 3 days with nothing but coconut water in front of you to drink. Obviously, Eduardo tried simplifying the process for safety and convenience, thinking that as long as he drank some water he could do it all and stay awake away from the waterfall itself. He was quite worried that he had ruined the process and thus ruined the desired effect, but he didn't. According to Eduardo, the process worked exactly as planned when he was in college years ago. He often spent very late nights doing homework. It wasn't something that I did it regularly, just a few times during projects or things like that. I once had a really difficult project for one of my classes. The good news is that I had one of my best friends in the class and we were project partners. So once I went to this friend's house that was a little bit far from the campus. I lived in a different university house with some roommates, a lot of my friends. About 5 minutes drive. We had a really long night working on the project, and I stayed there until around 2 in the morning, but we were finally done. Then I was able to get out and drive back to my house. When I left my friend's house, I walked to my car and started driving home. At that time, the streets were very quiet. In fact, I didn't see any other cars in the first few days. Minutes, but shortly after turning into a street, I remember noticing some headlights behind me. I continued driving, and I realized that a car was following me very closely. I wasn't driving particularly slowly or anything, so it seemed strange to me. When I took a few more curves, the car continued to follow me. When I got close to my house, I suspected that they were following me. I didn't know who was driving that car, but being so late at night, I had a bad feeling about it. When I got to my street, I started parking on the side of the road, more or less in front of my house. We didn't have a driveway, so I had to park on the street and cost, and when I did, I saw that the car behind was also stopping. I knew it wasn't any of my roommates. I thought about getting out of the car and getting in the house, but decided not to. Instead, I just sat inside the car and waited to see what the car behind me would do. In a matter of seconds, the driver's door opened. I looked in my mirror and saw a man come out and start walking towards me. I didn't recognize that guy and had no idea who he was. He was walking quickly straight to me. Next to me, I had a bad feeling about this, and just as the man was about to reach my door, I stepped on the gas in the mirror, watched the man start running back his vehicle. I knew it had to be fast, so I sped to the end of my street and then turned right. Then I quickly left on another residential street. I got a good distance from him, and I could see it behind me, but I also knew that we were pretty much the only two cars driving at that time. So I continued to speed away. I took a few more streets and then saw a gas station. I went into the parking lot of the gas station and went to the least used part with some parking spaces. After parking, I turned off the headlights and waited to check. Hours ago, I could see some nearby residential streets, and a few moments later I saw a car passing by. I think it was the guy, for it wasn't 5 minutes before I heard a shooting sound. I continued to wait there in the parking lot of the gas station for about 20 minutes and no one showed up, so I suspected that I had shot into the air and not someone. Fortunately, he didn't go near the gas station. After all this, I turned on my headlights and drove carefully back home. I knew the way to. I came back, and I really didn't want the guy to see me. I managed to come back and park quickly. Luckily, the car didn't come back. I've always wondered, though, why he followed me. What did he want from me? And why he shot? I mean, I don't even know who the guy was. I didn't have any money and my car was old. I have a story I need to tell, although I admit that I still have a hard time talking about it. What we lived that time night is not something easy to explain and much less to forget. This happened in January 2024 in a rural area near Guadalajara, Jalisco. I prefer not to reveal my name or that of the people involved. I do not want to be recognized or that our lives are affected by what I am going to relate. I can only say that it all happened in an old cabin owned by the father of a good friend. I am 27 years old and I have always been an active person, full of energy. Being a martial arts instructor has kept me in shape and with sharp reflexes, something that undoubtedly helped me survive that night. It all started quite simply. Like any other day, I left work. I went to train a little at the academy and at the end my friend Ricardo invited us to spend the weekend in a cabin far from the city in a small town called San Antonio de los Arcos. The plan sounded perfect: hair, pure tranquility and a good barbecue between friends. In addition to Ricardo and I, my wife Sophia and another couple of friends Andrea and Marcos would go. Everything was planned. The next day we left early, loaded the car with provisions and took the road. The journey was not long, and before noon we were already in the cabin. It was a rustic place surrounded by leafy trees and with a small river that ran a few meters away. It seemed the perfect place to disconnect from the hustle and bustle of the city. When we arrived, we unloaded everything, turned on the grill and began to prepare the meat. Ricardo took the opportunity to invite an old friend of his, a man I will call Joaquin, who lived in a small house near there. In the middle of the afternoon, Joaquin arrived with a bottle of artisanal tequila under his arm and an expression that, although friendly, hid some concern between laughter and anecdotes. The afternoon flew by, however. At nightfall, Joaquin stopped smiling while he was pouring us a round of tequila. His voice lowered his tone and said, "You shouldn't stay outside for too long. When it gets dark lately, strange things have been happening around here." We all look at him curiously. He continued, "Some animals dead, completely dry, as if something had sucked all their blood. I've even heard strange screams in the bush. I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, he's not alone." The tension was immediately felt in the air. Andrea let out a small nervous laugh, but no one else said anything. Joaquin looked at us one by one and then added, "If you hear something strange tonight, don't go out." The silence was uncomfortable. Finally, Joaquin, he said goodbye and returned to his house. We tried to regain good spirits, but the atmosphere had changed. The flesh was no longer the same. The laughter was fading, and little by little each one was looking for refuge inside the cabin. Close to midnight, Sophia and I went to bed. Marcos and Andrea did the same, while he decided to stay in the living room watching a movie on his phone for some reason. No more. I could sleep. There was a strange ringing in my ears, and every little noise from outside made me jump. I don't know how long it was, but at some point I heard something that made my blood run cold. A scream, a high-pitched, terrifying scream coming from outside. I sat up suddenly on the bed and saw that Sophia was also awake, her eyes wide open. "You heard that?" she whispered in a trembling voice. I nodded. I got up slowly and went towards the window outside. Everything was dark, but the branches of the trees were swaying violently as if something big was moving between them. Suddenly we heard another noise, this time much closer, a sharp bang against one of the walls from the cabin. Then a prolonged scratch as if something was scratching the wood. "Ricardo," I shouted from the room. He answered almost immediately. "What's going on?" Marcos and Andrea also came out from their rooms. We were all together in the hallway, looking at each other with fear painted on our faces. "I'm going to go out and check," Ricardo said. Decision didn't shout, "Sophia, don't go out." But he had already taken a flashlight and was opening the front door outside. The air was heavy and dense. Ricardo's flashlight lit the way, but the light barely made it through the darkness. We all followed him closely, some armed with makeshift sticks and an old machete we found in the cabin. No, we hadn't gone more than 20 meters when we saw it on the side of an old tree. Something was moving slowly. It was a hunched silhouette with long, thin arms that almost brushed the ground. Its eyes, two yellowish dots, were staring at us with an inhuman intensity. "What the hell is that?" Marcos whispered. The creature made a guttural noise, something between a growl and a squeal, sharp, that made our skin crawl without warning, began to move towards us with surprising speed. "Run!" I screamed with all my strength. We ran as if our lives depended on it, because in reality that's how it was. The creature advanced with a speed impossible for its limbs, so long and thin. We could hear its strides and that guttural and harsh sound it emitted. While chasing us, close the door, Ricardo shouted as he entered the room. Marcos was the last to cross the threshold, and with all our might we pushed a heavy table against the front door, breathing inside our chests, outside the silence. He was present for a few seconds, but he was interrupted by the noise of something scratching the wood. "This one is trying to get in," Andrea asked with tears in her eyes. "Calm down, everyone," I said, trying to control my own trembling voice. "Maybe it's just curiously." Ricardo shone his flashlight on one of the windows, and then we saw him again. There was the creature watching us with those yellowish eyes that glowed in the dark. Its head moved from side to side with spasmodic movements, as if trying to understand that we were his hands with elongated fingers and sharp nails leaning against the glass of the window. "He can't enter, right?" Sophia exclaimed, clinging to my arm. "Everyone on the floor, turn off the lights," I ordered in a low voice. We threw ourselves on the floor, remaining in absolute silence. We could hear how the creature moved around the cabin, lightly hitting the walls and scratching the windows with those horrible claws. The weather, it seemed to have stopped. I don't know how long we were there, lying on the floor holding our breath. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the noise stopped. It went away. Andrea whispered. "I don't know," replied Ricardo, "but we can't get out now. We stay together in the living room, lit only by a small battery lamp in the cabin. No one could sleep." Sophia trembled in my arms while Andrea murmured a prayer in a loud voice. "Come down, listen," Marcos said suddenly, with a pale face. "You don't hear that?" Silence was broken by a creepy sound, a distant screech as if the creature was calling something or someone. "We're not alone," Ricardo murmured with his eyes wide open. "There are more of those things." No one said anything. The fear was so intense that it could be felt in the air. "We have to get out of here at dawn," I said. "Finally, we can't stay for longer." Everyone nodded silently. All that remained was to wait. The night was moving slowly. Every minute felt eternal outside. From time to time we heard distant noises, branches breaking, something running through the trees, and those indescribable shrieks. When finally the first rays of the sun began to illuminate the horizon, no one said anything. We just slowly got up, picked up our things, and got ready to leave. "We have to go all together," Ricardo said firmly. No one separates understood. We nodded and, armed with machetes and sticks, opened the door. Outside, the morning light made everything seem safer, but the air still felt heavy. We rushed towards the cars. The footprints in the hole were deep and strange, as if several creatures had been walking around the cabin during the night. "Hurry up," I shouted, but just as we were about to get into the cars, a noise made us stop. It was a low, guttural growl coming from the forest. We stood paralyzed, looking into the thick trees. Out of the shadows we saw a tall, hunched figure move. It was the same creature as the night before, but this time she was not alone. Around her, 3 other similar silhouettes were slowly emerging from the forest. "Get into the car," Marcos shouted. We hurried up. The engine roared as Ricardo turned the key, and the tires squeaked against the mud as the car sped down the dirt road. Through the rearview mirror I could see the creatures running after us. Their movements were fast, almost unnatural. But as we moved out of sight, no one said anything on the way back. The silence was heavy, only broken by our heavy breaths and the roar of the engine. When we reached the nearest town, we stopped at a small gas station. We got off the car and we looked at each other. No one knew what to say. Finally Ricardo broke the silence. "We can't tell this to anyone. No one is going to believe us." We all nod silently. By water, clean the car a little, and continue our journey back to the city. However, there was something none of us said, but all those things were still there in some corner of the forest, lurking, waiting, and the worst of all is we knew that no matter what happened, we weren't the only ones who had had an encounter with them. The journey back to the city was silent and tense. Each of us was immersed in our thoughts, trying to process what we had experienced. Despite the daylight and the bustle of the road, I couldn't get the yellowish eyes of those creatures or their unnatural movements out of our minds. When finally we arrived in Guadalajara, we said goodbye with a few words. Ricardo left everyone at home and we went straight to our apartment. Sophia didn't say anything for hours. She just sat on the sofa, hugging her knees with a lost look. I couldn't speak either. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure hunched over in the darkness, looking at me from the shadows. That night no one slept. The next day I woke up with a pain unbearable in my chest. When I checked myself in front of the mirror, I noticed something that froze my blood. 3 deep marks like scratches ran down my torso from top to bottom. The wound seemed to have infected. The area around it was red and throbbing. "My God," Sophia exclaimed. "When she saw them, we have to go to the hospital." In the hospital, the doctor who treated me examined the wounds carefully. "What happened to you?" he asked with a frown. "These are not, they are common wounds. They seem to be made by claws." I was silent. I couldn't tell him the truth. "It was an animal," I lied. "We were in the field and something attacked us." The doctor didn't seem convinced, but he didn't ask any more questions. He prescribed antibiotics and asked me to come back if the wounds didn't improve in a few days. Back home, I received a message from Ricardo in the group we had created to plan the trip. "They are fine. They have noticed something strange since we returned." I replied that yes, everything was quiet, although it was clearly a lie. Sophia and I had not slept, and the atmosphere in our apartment felt heavy, almost oppressive. A few days later, Marcos called us. His voice sounded tense, nervous. "Andrea is not well. He says that he hears things at night like whispers outside the window, and the worst thing is that I also hear them." I hearing that, because although I hadn't mentioned it, Sophia and I had also heard strange things in our apartment for the past few nights. Soft noises like nails scraping would coming from the bedroom window. "We have to meet," I said firmly. "We can't ignore this." That same afternoon we met at everyone's house. We looked like we had aged years in just a few days. Andrea had deep dark circles under her eyes, and her hands were shaking slightly. Marcos kept looking out the window as if he expected to see something out there. "This didn't end that night," Ricardo said, breaking the silence. "Whatever we saw out there, it didn't go on." "It can't be," Sophia whispered. "For God's sake." "How is it possible?" "I don't know," Marcos replied. "But since we came back, I feel like something is watching us." Andrea, she started crying softly. Last night I saw something in the window. She was standing there looking at me. I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard that screech again. The air in the room became dense. We all knew it. Those creatures had marked us in some way, and now they were following us. "We have to go back," I finally said, breaking the silence. "You're crazy," Sophia shouted. "We can't go back to that place." "We have to," I replied firmly. "We can't live like this, in constant fear. Maybe if we go back, we will be able to do it. Help you understand what happened, or maybe close this once and for all." The silence took over the room. Finally Ricardo nodded. "It's okay, but we won't go alone. We'll get ready." This time, 2 days later, we were back on the road to the cabin. This time we were better prepared. We carried machetes, flashlights, high provisions, and a couple of firearms that Ricardo had gotten from an acquaintance, but the atmosphere was different. This time no one was talking. You could only hear the roar of the engine and the wind hitting the windows. When we reached the cabin, the place seemed darker, colder. The footprints were still there, etched in the dry mud. The windows were scratched, and the front door had deep claw marks. "This doesn't look good," Marcos murmured. We entered carefully, illuminating every corner with our flashlights. The place, it was exactly as we had left it that morning. There was a strange smell in the air, something like sulfur or rotting flesh. "Let's check the surroundings," Ricardo said. "We have to find something, anything that will help us understand what we saw." We split into pairs. Ricardo and Marcos went to the river while Sophia and I checked. "Let's go to the small forest behind the cabin." The silence was sepulchral. Every rustle of the leaves under our feet made me jump. "You heard that?" he whispered. "Sophia." I stopped in dry. Somewhere in the distance, I heard that same high-pitched screech that had followed us that night. "They're here," I said quietly. Suddenly, we heard a heart-rending scream coming from the river. It was Ricardo. "Run!" His voice was heard through the trees. Sophia and I ran back to the cabin. When we arrived, we saw Marcos dragging Ricardo, who I had a deep wound in my leg. We were ambushed. Jade Marcos are everywhere. The creatures began to appear among the trees. Dozens of yellowish eyes glowed in the darkness. They moved around the windows. This time they were not playing. This time they were coming for us. The air inside the cabin was thick, full of fear and despair. Outside, the shrieks multiplied and the shadows slid through the windows, distorting the light from our flashlights. The creatures were there surrounding us, waiting for the perfect moment to attack. "We can't stay here," Ricardo said with a broken voice, holding his injured leg. "If those things come in, we are dead. We have to resist until dawn," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. "We just have to hold on for a few more hours," Sophia cried silently. Clinging to Andrea's arm, Marco held tightly the machete she was carrying, his gaze fixed on the door. Time had stopped. Every second felt like an hour. Every creak outside made us jump in fear. Suddenly a dry knock shook the front door. The creatures were trying to get in. The scratches became more intense, more desperate, and the windows began to vibrate under the pressure of those monstrous hands. "They are not going to stop," Andrea shouted. I silently ordered with a commanding whisper. But it was too late. One of the windows shattered with a deafening roar, and a long, bony claw entered through the hole, shaking frantically in the air. Behind, Marcos shouted, sticking the machete into the claw. The creature let out a high-pitched shriek that made us cover the ooze and withdrew his arm, leaving a trail of black blood on the ground. But the damage was already done. The creatures knew we were cornered and weren't going to stop. "We have to get out," Ricardo said firmly through the back door. Now we took our things hurriedly, machetes, flashlights, and the old rifle Ricardo had brought helped Ricardo to get up, while Sophia and Andrea stayed close to me on the count. 3 of us opened the door and ran. I said with my heart hammering me in my chest, 1, 2, 3 ES. The back door burst open and we ran out into the forest, lighting the way with the flashlights behind us. We heard the screams and shrieks of the creatures. We could feel their presence, following their footsteps rumbling on the wet ground. We ran without looking back, dodging branches and stones, going deeper and deeper into the forest. The cold of the early morning dug into our bones, but we couldn't stop. "The river," Marcos shouted. "We can cross it and mislead." The sound of running water grew louder as we got closer. When we reached the edge of the river, we stopped for an instant. The current was strong and the water dark and icy. It seemed like an endless abyss. "There's no time to doubt," I screamed and jumped into the water. One of us all plunged into the river, fighting against the current, while the creatures piled up on the shore, watching us with those yellowish eyes full of fury. When we got to the other side, we were in the mud, twisting and panting. I looked back and saw that the creatures had not crossed the river. They stayed there at the water's edge, emitting those eerie screeches before slowly disappearing into the shadows of the forest. "They left?" Sophia asked, shivering with cold and fear. "I don't know," I answered, trying to catch my breath. "But we have to keep moving forward. We can't stay here." We walked for hours aimlessly, following the dim light that began to appear on the horizon. When we finally left the forest, we find ourselves on an abandoned road. "We are safe," Andrea exclaimed, breaking down in tears. An old truck passed by the road, and when it saw us, the driver, an older man with a sun-weathered face, looked at us in disbelief. "What happened to them?" he asked. "They seem to have seen himself." "Please take him," Marcos replied in a broken voice. "We don't want to go back there ever again." The man took us to a small police station in a nearby town. There they offered us food, blankets, and medical attention. But when they tried to ask us what had happened, no one could say a word. "It was an animal," he said finally, Ricardo, with his eyes fixed on the ground. "We were attacked by a wild animal. We knew that no one would believe us if we told the truth. No one would believe what we had seen in that forest, what had chased us, what had almost killed us." After that day, each one went our own way. Marcos and Andrea moved from Ciudad. Ricardo closed his father's cabin and put it up for sale. Sophia and we tried to get our lives back on, but something in us had changed forever. Sometimes on the quietest nights I still hear those squeals in my mind. Sometimes I feel those yellowish eyes watching me from some dark corner. We never spoke again about what happened. We never went back to that place. The only thing I know for sure is that there are things in this world that can't be explained. Things that lurk in the shadows waiting for the right time to come out. And if you ever go into a remote forest on a moonless night, remember this: you're not alone. Something is watching you. I grew up in a small town in southern Mexico called San Isidro de los Cruces. I never witnessed anything supernatural directly, but I always heard spooky stories told by my parents and especially by my uncles. Of all those stories, there are one that always left me with goosebumps. A story that my uncle lived when he was young. My family was made up of 2 uncles and 3 aunts. One of them had been adopted when she was just a baby. According to my grandmother, my aunt's biological mother was a humble woman who, due to life circumstances, could not raise her. It was then that my grandparents took her in as their own daughter. All my uncle Sebastian was the most rebellious. Unlike my other uncle Francisco, who was calm and obedient, Sebastian had an impulsive personality, and according to what they said, he was even a little troublesome. He was the youngest son, my grandfather's darling, who forgave him all his mischief. Sebastian had a reputation for being daredevil, a troublemaker, and his relationship with my grandfather became more and more tense over time. The most great among them arose for a vacant lot that Sebastian wanted to build himself a small house. But the real reason was not only independence. Sebastian was in love with a young woman named Elisa, daughter of a retired former commander. Elisa was a beautiful girl, but with a complicated history. Her father was a violent and authoritarian man, known for having shot a suitor who dared to court his daughter from the window from his house one night after a strong argument with my grandfather. Sebastian left the house with a slamming door. The reason for the fight was the same as always: his relationship with Elisa and his desire to have that land. My grandmother tried to stop him. She begged him not to go out with that attitude. But Sebastian was blinded by anger. "I don't care what they say, I'm leaving," he shouted before disappearing into the darkness. That night Sebastian walked for a long time along a lonely cobbled road that crossed the town. His destination was the house of Don Jose Villanueva, an old man who had a small shop bar on the outskirts just after the municipal cemetery. When Sebastian arrived, the shop was closed. He knocked on the door several times, but no one answered. He stood for a while in front of the door, feeling cold from the night and the silence. Suddenly he heard the creak of a bicycle slowly approaching down the road. The cyclist was an old man with a strange appearance. He wore an old and threadbare hat, and his clothes seemed too loose for his thin body. Sebastian watched silently as the old man stopped a few meters away from him. "Good night, young man," said the old man in a deep voice, and paused. "Where is he going?" "So in the afternoon." Sebastian explained that he was looking for Don Jose to buy some liquor, but that it seemed that the man was not at home. The old man smiled slightly and took a bottle of brandy from a bag that hung from his bicycle. "If what you are looking for is a drink, boy, here I bring enough to share," he said as he unscrewed the lid of the house and took a long drink directly from it. The smell of the man was strong, almost unbearable, but Sebastian, driven by the cold and the anger he still carried, accepted the invitation for a while. They both drank in silence under the dim light of an old lantern that hung near the road. The old man seemed to know a lot about the town. He talked about families, with known surnames and secrets that no one should know. "I know the Villanuevas, the Mendozas, the Lopezes. I also know your young grandfather Sebastian," he said suddenly, fixing his gaze on him. Sebastian felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't remember having told the old man his name. "How do you know my name?" he asked, trying to sound firm. The old man smiled, showing yellowish teeth, and uneven. "In this town one always knows more than it seems." Time seemed to have stopped. The cold became more intense, and the light of the lantern began to flicker like if it was about to go out. The old man refilled the cap of the bottle with brandy and offered it to Sebastian. "Come on, come with me to the cemetery. There we can finish this bottle in peace," he said in a whispering voice. Sebastian felt a knot in his stomach. The old man's smile had faded, and now it seemed more like a grotesque grimace than a friendly expression. "No thanks, I think it's time for me to go." A step back, but the old man didn't accept one as an answer. With inhuman speed, he held Sebastian's arm with a force that didn't match his frail. "I told you to come with me," he growled in a voice that seemed to come from the depths of his throat. The old man's face began to change. His eyes turned completely black as a bottomless pit, and his mouth opened more beyond the natural, showing rows of sharp and pointed teeth. Sebastian's heart was beating hard. He tried to let go. The old man's strength was huge. "Let me go," he screamed desperately, but his words seemed to be lost in the night. The old man began to drag him towards the entrance of the cemetery, where a heavy rusty iron gate creaked with every slight movement of the wind. And just when Sebastian thought his fate was sealed, something unexpected happened. The wind was cold among the tombstones, making the sound of the old iron gate of the cemetery creak like a distant lament. Sebastian struggled with all his might to free himself from the old man's claws, but it was like trying to free himself from an iron stock. The man's wrinkled hand was firm, cold, and his bony fingers seemed to dig into Sebastian's skin. "I told you that you would accompany me," growled the old man with a deep and unnatural guttural voice as if coming from the depths of the on the ground. Sebastian began to scream for help, but only silence answered him. The darkness of the road seemed to close around him, and the air had become so dense that it was hard for him to breathe. The old man's face had transformed. His skin was stretched and pale, with dark veins visible beneath the surface. His eyes, two black and empty holes, did not blink. As he was dragged towards the cemetery, Sebastian felt his legs. They faltered. Every step seemed to weigh tons, and fear clouded their thoughts. Suddenly an idea crossed his mind. "Pray, my God, help me, don't let me die." Here he screamed with all his might, his voice broken by terror. Something changed in the atmosphere. The old man let out an inhuman growl, a shriek so sharp that it echoed through the trees. His skin began to smoke, and a kind of black mist began to come out of his mouth. "Open, you can't escape from me," roared the creature, but his voice was no longer so firm. Sebastian felt that the pressure in his arm decreased, and with a desperate pull he managed to let go. He ran with all his strength, tripping over stones and roots that he could barely see in the gloom. The sound of his own footsteps resounded in his ears, and his breathing was short. When he reached the door of his house, he knocked desperately. My grandmother was the one who opened the door. He had a rosary in his hand and his eyes full of tears. "Sebastian, thank God you came back," he exclaimed. Taking him in his arms, Sebastian didn't respond. He gently pushed my grandmother, ran to the back of the house, and locked himself in his room. He sat on the floor with his back against the door and buried his face between his knees. His whole body trembled and cold sweat ran down his forehead. My grandmother stood in the hallway, murmuring prayers and crossing herself over and over again. She knew that something terrible had happened to her grandson, but she did not insist on asking him questions that night. The next morning Sebastian did not leave his room. It was days before he finally dared to talk to Francisco, who had noticed the radical change in his younger brother Sebastian. "What did you see that night?" Francisco asked one afternoon while they were sitting in the small backyard of the house. Sebastian was silent for a few seconds, staring at the ground. Finally he spoke in a low voice, almost as if he feared that someone else might hear him. "It wasn't a man, Francisco. That thing that grabbed me was something else. I can't explain it, but I wanted to take me to the cemetery. I felt like I was going to die." Francisco listened silently. He knew that Sebastian was not lying. The terror in his eyes was proof enough. But there was another person who also knew what had happened that night. Don Jose Villanueva, the owner of the bar. A few days later Francisco convinced Sebastian to accompany him to visit Don Jose. When they arrived, the old man greeted them with a serious expression on his face. His skin was pale and his hands trembled slightly as he had a cup. "I heard part of what happened that night," Don Jose said, looking directly at Sebastian. "But I didn't dare to open the door. He was sick, with a fever, and something told me that I shouldn't go out." Sebastian nodded slowly. "He heard the screams?" Francisco asked. The old man put the cup on the table and rubbed his trembling hands. "I heard your screams, Sebastian. But I also heard another voice. A voice that was not human." Silence filled the small room. Only the sound of the wind seeping through the cracks of the window broke the stillness. "That thing that attacked you was not of this world." Don Jose continued, lowering his voice. "But you know something. This is not the first time something like this has happened. Many years ago, another young man just like you, Sebastian, had an encounter with that old man on the way to the cemetery." Sebastian felt a chill. "What happened to that young man?" Francisco asked in a trembling voice. Don Jose stared at the flame of the candle on the table before answering. "He never returned home. They say that his body was found days later inside the cemetery." The words were suspended in the air like a heavy shadow. Sebastian looked at Francisco, who was as scared as he was. "Be careful," Don Jose finally said. "That way and that way. Cemetery are not places for everyone." When they left Don Jose's house, Sebastian and Francisco walked in silence through the dark streets of the town. The wind was blowing strongly, and the shadows of the lampposts seemed to lengthen in an unnatural way. Both knew that this story was not over. The days passed, but Sebastian's gaze was still lost, as if he were still trapped in that hellish night. He avoided exchanging glances with anyone, and when he left the house he did so before the sun went down. My grandmother, a woman of unbearable faith, continued to pray every night with her rosary in her trembling hands. Francisco, on the other hand, could not get that story out of his head. Something in which Sebastian had told seemed incomplete, as if a piece of the puzzle were missing. The conversation with Don Jose Villanueva had only stoked his suspicions. One night, while Sebastian, he slept soundly after days of insomnia, Francisco made a risky decision. He would return to the road that led to the cemetery. He needed answers. The full moon partially illuminated the path of irregular stones, casting elongated shadows on the ground. The wind blew between the branches of the trees, producing a high-pitched sound reminiscent of a distant lament. Francisco carried with him an old kerosene lantern that trembled with each faggot of cold air. When he reached the exact point where Sebastian had said he found the old man, Francisco stopped. The silence was sepulchral, and the smell of damp earth permeated the air. He looked around, looking for any sign, some clue that could explain what had happened that night. Then he heard a sound behind him. "Good night," said a deep and raspy voice. Francisco turned so fast that he almost dropped the lantern. There on the side of the road was an old man with a worn-out hat and loose clothes. His eyes remained hidden under the brim of his hat, and in his right hand he held a bottle of hot water. "Look for something, young man?" asked the old man with a crooked smile. Francisco felt a lump in his throat, but he took a deep breath and kept the compost. "Who are you?" he asked firmly. The old man gave him his head lightly, as if he were studying Francisco. "Let's say I'm someone. He knows this place very well," he replied by taking a long swig from the bottle. Francisco's heart began to beat hard, every fiber of his body. He asked him to run, but he remained firmly in his place. "What did he do to my brother that night?" Francisco asked in a trembling voice. The old man smiled again, but this time his smile seemed more like a grotesque grimace than a friendly gesture. "Your brother was lucky, boy. Others have not run with the same fortune." Francisco took a step back, but the old man did not move an inch. "Why does he do this?" Francisco asked, feeling a chill run down his spine. "Because some souls are weak, easy to manipulate. Others instead fight like your brother. But tell me, young man, you also want to accompany me to the cemetery?" The old man stepped forward, and the light of the flashlight revealed a detail terrifying. His feet did not touch the ground. Francisco quickly retreated, but tripped over a stone and fell backwards. The lantern rolled on the ground, leaving the scene barely illuminated by the pale moonlight. The old man began to approach slowly. His shadow lengthened on the ground in an unnatural way. "My God, protect me!" Francisco shouted, closing his eyes tightly when he opened them again. The old man had disappeared. There was no trace left, only the icy wind and the distant bark of a dog somewhere in the village. Francisco got up hurriedly, picked up the fallen flashlight, and ran back home without looking back. His heart seemed about to explode, and every shadow around him seemed to move. And watching him when he reached the door of his house, he knocked hard until Sebastian came to open it. Francisco's face was pale, and his breathing was agitated. "What happened?" Francisco asked. Sebastian, alarmed, "I saw him. I saw the same man you had that night," Francisco replied, trembling from head to toe. Sebastian remained motionless for a few seconds, finally looked into his brother's eyes and nodded slowly. "Then it wasn't my imagination," Sebastian murmured in a broken voice. "My grandmother appeared in the hallway, holding her rosary tightly, crossed herself several times before speaking. Listen to me well, children. What you saw was not a man. It was something older, something that has been here long before this town existed." Sebastian and Francisco were silent, listening to every word carefully. "There are spirits that feed on the fear of weak souls. That being is one of them," my grandmother continued. "But as long as they keep their faith, as long as they do not fall into their traps, my grandmother's words will be safe. They were a momentary bomb, but they did not erase the fear that they both carried stuck in their chests. That night no one slept in the house. The silence was broken only by the wind hitting the windows and the whispers of my grandmother. However, even with the protection of prayers and the warmth of home, everyone knew that that entity was still out there, waiting." Several months passed since that night, but the shadow of what happened, he never completely left our house. Sebastian was still a different man, although he tried to resume his life. His eyes betrayed a constant fear, as if something invisible was chasing him in every corner. Francisco, for his part, never went back to the cemetery. My grandmother, with her rosary always in her hands, prayed every night, asking for protection for her children. However, there was something in the atmosphere that still felt broken, incomplete, as if a dark presence still surrounded me nearby. One afternoon, while I was helping my grandmother prepare dinner, Sebastian rushed into the house. His hands trembled and his voice was barely a whisper. "I saw him again," he said with bulging eyes. He was standing on the road by the entrance of the cemetery. Francisco stood up immediately. "We can't go on living like this. This has to end," she exclaimed with determination. My grandmother looked at them with a serene face, but her eyes were full of sadness. "Children, this will not end until you face that being," she said in a firm voice. "But you will not be alone." My grandmother took out of a small trunk a wooden cross, a bottle of holy water, and a small bunch of pyru branches tied with a red string. "Carry this with you. Pray with faith. Do not speak to him. Do not look him directly in the eye, and no matter what happens, do not accept anything he offers you." That same night, Sebastian and Francis, armed with my grandmother's recommendations, the cross and the holy water, returned to the road that led to the cemetery. The moon was covered by thick clouds and darkness was almost absolute. They walked in silence, each step resounding with an echo unsettling among the stones of the path. The cold wind blew through the trees, and each shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. When they reached the point where Sebastian had had his first meeting with the old man, they stopped. The silence was so deep that they could hear the beating of their own hearts. Suddenly a familiar voice broke the silence. "Good night, young people." There he was, standing under a dry tree with his threadbare hat and his bottle of burning AG in his hand. His eyes, two dark wells, reflected an indescribable evil. "They have come to accompany me?" he asked with a grotesque smile, showing his yellowish and sharp teeth. Francisco held the wooden cross tightly, and Sebastian began to murmur a prayer. The old man took a step forward, and with each step he took his figure seemed to distort more. His shadow lengthened over the road, and the air it became thick, difficult to breathe. "We are not afraid of you," Francis shouted, holding the cross aloft. The old man gave a guttural growl like the roar of a wild animal, and his mouth began to open in an unnatural way, stretching until it almost reached his ears. From inside emerged a dark and dense smoke that seemed to look like it had a life of its own. Sebastian, with the bottle of holy water in his hand, threw it towards the old man, while pronouncing in a firm voice, "In the name of God, the holy water recedes," touched the old man's skin, and he let out a scream so loud that Francisco and Sebastian's ears were ringing. His foot began to sizzle and give off a nauseating smell like rotting flesh burning. "This does not end here," the creature shouted in a distorted voice as its body began to crumble into ashes black that the wind dragging in a matter of seconds. Nothing was left but a pile of ashes scattered on the road. Silence returned, and the moon, as if it had waited for that moment, came out through the clouds, softly illuminating the path. Sebastian and Francisco stood there paralyzed, trying to process what had just happened. Without saying a word, they started the way back home. When they arrived, my grandmother was already waiting for them at the door with tears in his eyes, and an expression of relief succeeded. He whispered before hugging them both that night for the first time in a long time. The house was calm. No whispers or knocks on the windows were heard, nor that inexplicable cold that was usually felt in the darkest corners. Over time, the story of Sebastian and Francisco became something of a local legend. Some said that the spirit of the old man I was still hovering near the cemetery waiting for a new victim. Others assured that thanks to what my uncles did, the spirit had finally been expelled from this world. The truth is that no one walked that path again after dark, and the entrance to the cemetery remained as a silent reminder that there are things that are better not to challenge. What I am about to narrate happened in the summer of 1996, when I was 29 years old at the time. I lived in a small town in the heart of Oaxaca, a place surrounded by hills, legends, and an environment that seemed to be taken from a horror story. That region was known for its enormous rocks and its vast dry vegetation, the home of countless stories of apparitions and inexplicable events. In those days a rumor circulated that turned the town upside down. An evil spirit, that of an ancient bandit who, according to what they said, roamed the most remote areas of the mountain. The stories were terrifying. Where the specter passed, the rivers dried up, the animals perished, and the travelers who dared to enter their territory returned deranged or simply disappeared. There were those who claimed that this being kidnapped women or stripped the unwary of everything they carried, while others swore that it was all nothing more than a story to keep away. To the curious, I never paid attention to those stories. It always seemed to me that they were exaggerations to scare outsiders, but that incredulity cost me dearly. One afternoon at the end of August my tranquility was broken. My animals, a small herd of goats, escaped from the corral. The sun was beginning to set behind the hills, but I refused to return without them. I mounted my horse and went into the mountain, convinced that he would find the animals near the rock formations. "Let's ride," he vanished between the silence and the solitude. My exhausted horse walked slowly with his head lowered. I, already feeling the weight of fatigue, clung to the reins in the hope of seeing some sign of the goats. It was then when, among the shadows of some stones, I thought I saw a movement. My heart skipped a beat. Thinking that it could be one of the goats, I approached cautiously, but found nothing but dry branches and rocks. I circled the place looking for some trace, but there was nothing. The silence was oppressive. The bare branches cast haunting shadows, figures that seemed to move at the edges of my vision. I decided to return to the corral, convinced that the goats would have returned on their own. However, as I took the road back, I heard a rustle behind. I turned quickly, but I didn't see anything. It must have been a dry branch, I said to myself. trying to calm down. A few minutes later the sound came closer. This time my horse raised his head sharply, looking nervously on both sides of the road. The horse's behavior began to worry me. I had always heard that animals are capable of perceiving things that we can't, and my horse seemed to be deeply uncomfortable, neighing, turning his head towards on the sides, and he was taking nervous steps. At one point he began to kick in the air as if something invisible was bothering him. I tried to calm him down by holding the reins tightly and talking to him in a calm tone, but the animal was out of his mind. Yes, it was then, when I heard a sound that froze my blood, clearly footsteps of someone running after us. The footsteps got stronger, faster, and they were getting closer. I turned my head with fear and I saw it. It was a human figure dressed in a wide hat and clothes that instantly recognized the typical attire of a bandit of yesteryear. A cangassero, I thought, although I knew it was not something common in this region. Whatever it was, that thing looked like a solid dark shadow, and without a visible face, panic invaded me. I tried to make the horse move forward, but at that moment the reins were accidentally released from my hands and the animal, as frightened as I was, shot out. I felt the wind hit my face as the horse ran at full speed, but I couldn't help but hear the rustling of branches and the sound of footsteps following us, as if that thing was running beside us, hidden among the bushes and shadows. After what seemed like eternal minutes, the noise ceased. My horse, exhausted and sweating, stumbled and fell into the ground, unable to continue. Quickly dismount, checking that the poor animal was alive, but completely exhausted. Its breathing was heavy, and its body trembled. I took some water from the jar I was carrying with me, pouring it into my hat so that the horse could drink. It was a small amount and clearly insufficient to relieve its fatigue. With no other option, I removed the saddle and the bridle from the horse, letting it rest, and decided to continue on foot, hoping to be able to. I noticed that the wind was beginning to blow strongly, lifting the dry dust from the road and erasing any traces of tracks, both the horses and mine. I tried to speed up my pace, but every time I turned I felt as if something was following me. The shadows of the bushes seemed to move unnaturally, and the rustling of the dry branches echoed behind me. When I saw something that gave me a spark of hope, a small group of my goats walking in the distance in the direction of the ranch, I decided to follow them, trying to use their bodies as cover as I went along. But as I followed her, fear grew inside me, as if something invisible was hiding just outside my field of vision. As I followed the goats, my steps were clumsy from the haste and tension that I was going through. I felt the mountain seemed darker and more menacing. With each passing minute, despite the moonlight, the crooked and dry trees cast shadows that looked like hands, trying to reach me. Finally I reached the edge of a small clearing where the goats stopped as if something had alerted them. They stared straight ahead, motionless, and that made me even more nervous. I advanced carefully, peering through the shadows. But there was nothing that I could suddenly see. The sound of branches breaking turned to my ears, this time louder and closer. I turned quickly, expecting to see some animal or even a person, but there was nothing. My hands were shaking as I tried to decide whether to move forward or stay still. It was then that two men on horseback appeared from the other side of the clearing. They were ranchers from the area, men known in the town for their rudeness and bravery. When they saw me, one of them, I was called my name. "Hey Luis, what are you doing here at this time?" With relief I told them what had happened, the escaped goats, the exhausted horse, and what I had seen in the bush. Both men exchanged looks of disbelief but said nothing. Finally the one who seemed to be the leader spoke. "Because you are not alone, friend. During the early morning someone stole some pigs from Don Marcos's ranch. We believe that the thief hid in this area and we are looking for him." I told them about the figure that had chased me, but they took it with skepticism. One of them laughed mockingly. "Those ghost stories are for children. Most likely you have seen the thief disguised to scare. Many do that to keep people away from their hiding places." Despite his words, they could not hide a slight nervousness. They decided it was better to continue searching before the thief completely escaped. They invited me to join them, and although the last thing I wanted was the bush, I felt safer in company. I mounted behind one of the men, and we advanced towards a denser area of the bush. As we rode, the silence took over the atmosphere again. Only the sound of hooves hitting the dry earth and the branches crunching under our feet nearby was heard. At midnight, something among the trees caught our attention. It was a rapid movement, as if someone were running through the branches. The men instinctively made their horses accelerate. "There it is," shouted one of them. What we saw was a dark lump that seemed to move with an inhuman speed, dodging trees and thorns as if they did not affect it. We were still driven more by adrenaline than by logical thought, but soon we realized it. Realizing that we had been guided to a place we didn't know, the terrain changed and became drier and stony. We found ourselves going down a narrow cleft between two huge rock walls. It was a place so narrow that only one horse could fit at a time. The animals began to get nervous, their legs slipped on the loose stones, and it neighed hard. "I don't like this at all," one of the men murmured as the horse tried to turn around, but there was no way back. The only option was to move forward. Although each of us felt that something terrible awaited us at the end of the road, the narrow pass led us to a clearing surrounded by high ravines, a place where the rocks formed a natural circle that seemed designed to trap us. The horses were restless, neighing and refusing to go any further. One of the men in calm his mount looked back and let out a scream. There it is. As I turned, I saw the figure, the same being that had chased me before, standing at the entrance of that clearing. His dark silhouette was unmistakable, the wide hat and the clothes of a bandit. But there was something else, something profoundly unnatural in his presence. He did not move, but his shadow seemed to lengthen and twist in the moonlight. The horses began to despair. One of them stood up on two legs, almost knocking down his rider. It was then that the bravest of the men, armed with a revolver, shouted, "Hey, what do you want?" The spectre did not answer. He simply remained there as if he were studying us. "Speak or blow your head off," the man continued, raising his weapon decisively when the figure did not move. He fired. 2 shots resounded in the stillness of the night. But the impact did nothing. The figure remained motionless as if the bullets had pierced the air. It was then, when he slowly raised his arms as if he were calling something from the depths of the earth, a thud came to us from the walls of the ravine. Small stones began to fall, followed by a small avalanche that closed the only exit we had. "We were trapped. This can't be happening," shouted the other man while his horse tried to flee without success. The figure began to walk slowly towards us. His movements were erratic, almost as if he was floating instead of the ground. My legs were shaking. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. It was at that moment that I understood that we were facing something that did not belong to this world. The man with the revolver, in a desperate attempt, he fired again, this time pointing at the sky as if he wanted to scare away to the spirit, but the spectre continued to advance closer and closer, its presence filling the air with an unbearable pressure. When it was a few meters from us, the horses, they became completely ungovernable. One of them let go of his rider, running in circles and neighing in terror. Mine also tried to retreat, but the walls of the ravine did not allow it. Suddenly the spectre stopped, raised a hand, and an icy wind hit me with such force that I had to cover my face. When I lowered my hands, the figure was gone, but the air was still charged with a heavy presence, as if it were watching us from some invisible place. The armed man put away his pistol resignedly. "This is not a thief," he murmured in a trembling voice. "We shouldn't have come." The clearing was completely silent after the disappearance of the figure, but fear continued to permeate. The air was in the air. The horses were circling restless, and the 3 men were paralyzed, not knowing what to do. The only way out of the place was blocked by the stones that had fallen. We tried to calm down and think clearly. One of the men, still clinging to the idea that all this could have a logical explanation, proposed to look for another way out. However, each corner of the clearing was surrounded by high ravines, and the walls were too steep to climb it without equipment. We were trapped, and the night was just beginning. The armed man, who until that moment had been the bravest, began to murmur prayers. It was a disconcerting contrast to see him so frightened after his defiant attitude. "This is not a thing for the living," he said in a low voice, almost as if talking to himself. We went where we shouldn't. We decided to wait until dawn, hoping that daylight would bring some relief. However, the night gave us no respite. From time to time we heard creaks between the rocks, as if something were moving in the darkness, which brought with it a strange murmur, as if many voices whispered at the same time. "Heard it?" I asked with a thread of voice. The others nodded, their pale faces reflecting the same terror I felt. The murmurs were unintelligible, but they seemed to approach and surround us as if something had happened. Suddenly one of the horses began to neigh, frantically, rising on 2 legs before falling to the ground. When we tried to approach him to calm him down, we saw marks on his skin as if something had scratched him. None of us dared to say it, but we all thought the same. We were not alone. The armed man suddenly got up, We can't stay here. If we don't go out now, we won't tell us. We try moving the stones that blocked the exit, but they were too big and heavy. We were desperate. Every noise, every shadow seemed a threat. The feeling of being trapped with something we couldn't see or understand was tearing our nerves. It was then that on one of the walls of the ravine we noticed something strange. A small cave, almost hidden between the rocks, seemed like an insignificant crack, but as we got closer we saw that it led to a more space. Ample with few options, we decided to investigate, hoping that it could be a way out inside the cave. The atmosphere was even more oppressive. The air was heavy and the ground was covered with dust and loose stones. As we advanced we noticed something disturbing, an old grave covered only with a few worn stones. As we approached we saw that there were human bones protruding from the ground, still dressed in clothes that we immediately recognized. A bandit outfit complete with a hat resting next to the skull. The armed man crossed himself and took a few steps back. It is the Kangasero. There is no doubt here they buried him, and we woke him up. We tried to stay calm, but at that moment a deafening noise resounded inside the cave. It was like a scream, a cry of fury that came from everywhere and none at the same time. The air inside the cave became more spear and hot. The feeling of suffocation grew with each passing second. It was as if the place was alive, breathing with uncontrollable fury. The sounds of the scream continued to reverberate on the rocks, but the most terrifying thing was that it did not seem to come from anywhere in particular. With heavy breathing and heart beating wildly, the armed man took a step back, his face full of dread. "He is watching us," exclaimed. The darkness inside the cave became denser, as if the shadows themselves wanted to swallow us. We were invaded by the sensation that something invisible was approaching, a presence that surrounded us, waiting for the right moment to attack us. Suddenly the horses that until that moment had remained restless but calm, began to move uncontrollably, hitting the walls of the cave as if they were trying to flee from something they could not see. The ground trembled under our feet and the stones began to fall, collapsing in the dark corners. "Let's get out of here," shouted one of the men without thinking. We began to run towards the exit of the cave. The echoes of our footsteps resounded on the walls of the cave, but the sound of something following us, something that was much closer than I dared to imagine, made us accelerate even more. When we finally reached the opening, we couldn't believe what we saw. The full moon was already illuminating the night, but the landscape had changed. The ravine that before seemed safe and accessible now looked completely different. The rocks seemed to move, twist as if they formed a labyrinth from which we could not get out. We realized that we were not in the same place as before. The feeling of being trapped intensified, as if we were trapped in an alien dimension. "This is not real." His or one of the men, trembling, the wind rose again, this time cold as ice from nothing. A shadow emerged from the depth, slow but inevitable. I recognized the Kangasero, the spirit that had chased us, standing among the rocks. The figure was not only still, but seemed to come and go, gliding through the fog that was beginning to form in the air. "We must go," the armed man shouted. We began to run without looking back. As we advanced, the murmurs, the whispers in the air grew louder until it became a deafening scream that pierced our bodies. The feeling that we were being watched, that something was close, was unbearable. Finally we arrived at a point where the fog cleared at our feet. The trail is open and we finally managed to find our way back. The Kangasero, or whatever it was, that did not chase us anymore. But the terror we had experienced accompanied us until dawn. When we returned to the ranch exhausted and almost out of breath, we did not talk anymore about what happened. No one cared about the disappearance of the pigs or the animals. What happened to us? The only thing that mattered was that we had escaped from something much more terrifying than any thief. The following days passed without incident, but we all knew that the Katinga is the place where everything seemed normal. It hid dark secrets. No one ever entered that corner of the mountains again, and the stories of the Kangasero continued to be told. Although with less courage, we had been the witnesses and we knew it. We were no longer the same. Thank you for joining me in this tour, full of stories. If you liked it, leave your like and subscribe to not miss more horror stories, and remember, in the description you will find links to everything you need. Our official store, the Members Club for early access and exclusive content, and much more. I am the Storyteller, and we will see you very soon in the shadows.